Welcome in the journey of time. Tonight, we'll unfold another page of history. Perhaps you're lying in bed, or maybe you've simply decided to let the past accompany you for a while. Where are you joining me from tonight? Leave a comment if you'd like. I always enjoy hearing about your corner of the world. And what time is it for you now? If you find this slow and thoughtful stories of those who came before us brings you a sense of peace and comfort, I'd be honored if you like and subscribe. So, here's the story. The Grinding Wheel of Time, a chronicle of Alaric the Miller. The Whisper of the Water. The river wending, a silver-blue serpent slithering through the verdant cloak of the English Midlands, knew secrets older than the stones of the Norman keeps beginning to punctuate its banks. Its voice, a constant, chattering murmur over rounded pebbles, spoke of time and toil. In the year of our Lord 1145, its most vital conversation was with a wooden structure that clung to its side like a stubborn burr, the watermill of Oakham. The mill was more than a building. It was a living entity. Its great wheel, turning with a rhythmic, groaning protest, was the beating heart of the manor. Its timbers, dark with the sweat of decades and pale with a perpetual dusting of flour, held the scent of yeast, damp stone, and slow, patient decay. Within its perpetual twilight, where sunbeams pierced cracks in the wall to illuminate swirling motes of flour like tiny, frantic ghosts, the fate of the village was ground into existence. The mill was the linchpin between the raw bounty of the earth and the bread that sustained life. And the keeper of this linchpin, the master of this dusty, noisy universe, was a man named Alaric. His story is not one of kings and battles, but of the gritty, granular texture of common life. It is a saga of water, wood, and wheat. Of a man whose hands were calloused from sacks, and whose soul was tempered by the millstone's relentless turn. This is his history. The Scent of Destiny. The world for the 5-year-old Alaric was a symphony of overwhelming sensations. The mill, where his father Cedric labored as an undermiller, was a place of terrifying wonder. The air itself felt thick, heavy with a strange, earthy perfume that caught in his throat. The scent of raw grain, a smell comparable to dry soil and sunshine captured in a million tiny kernels. On this day, his small hand was engulfed by his father's work-roughened grasp. Cedric was a giant of a man, his shoulders broad from heaving sacks of grain that weighed more than a grown sheep. His tunic, a coarse homespun wool, was permanently dusted a ghostly white, and flour nestled in the lines of his weathered face, settling into the creases around his eyes when he smiled. "Steady now, little mouse," Cedric's voice rumbled, a sound deeper than the mill's groaning gears. "The wheel is not to be feared, but respected. It has more strength in its timbers than a team of oxen." Alaric peered through the gaps in the planked floor of the milling room. Below, the water wheel churned, its paddles slapping against the churning, peat-brown water of the Leat with a sound like a wet cloth striking stone. The entire structure trembled with a constant, vibrant hum that traveled up through the soles of his thin leather shoes and into his very bones. It was a feeling of immense, contained power. "Why does it groan so, father?" Alaric whispered, his eyes wide. Cedric hoisted a sack of rye onto his shoulder with a grunt. It groans because work is hard, son. The river pushes, the wheel turns, the gears complain, but they do their duty. Without that groan, there is no flour. Without flour, there is no bread. Our task is to listen to its voice. A change in its pitch can warn of a cracked tooth on the cogwheel or a stone jammed in the grind. We must listen. He led Alaric to the center of the room, where the two millstones, the Meta and the Catullus, sat like slumbering giants. The lower stone was fixed, while the upper, driven by the power of the wheel and a labyrinth of wooden gears, rotated. The furrows carved into their faces, the harps, were intricate patterns, a language of efficiency and wear. Cedric ran a hand over the cool, rough granite. "This stone came from the quarries far to the north," he said, his tone becoming reverent. "It took 10 men and a wagon pulled by 8 oxen a full month to bring it here. It is the heart of the mill. It must be true, its balance perfect. A wobble, even one the width of a hair, and it will shatter itself, the grain, and maybe the man tending it." Alaric reached out a tentative finger to touch the stone. Its surface was unexpectedly cold, a deep geological chill that seemed to suck the warmth from his skin. He could feel the tiny, sharp crystals of the granite. This was not like the warm, pliable earth of the village fields. This was ancient, unyielding, and powerful. His father then showed him the toll dish, a worn wooden bowl used to measure the Lord's share. "One measure in every 16 belongs to the Lord William," Cedric explained, his voice dropping slightly. "We keep careful count. The mill is the Lord's, the river is the Lord's, the very air we breathe while working here is the Lord's. Remember that." Later, when the great wooden lever was engaged and the gears clunked into motion, the upper stone began to spin. The noise escalated from a hum to a roar, a deep, grating thunder that filled the world. Cedric poured a stream of golden wheat into the central eye of the spinning stone. A fine, warm dust puffered into the air, and from the gap between the stones, a pale, beautiful stream of wholemeal flour began to flow, collecting in the waiting trough. Cedric caught a handful and let it sift through his fingers. See, life itself. Alaric sneezed, the flour tickling his nose. But in that moment, surrounded by the thunderous music of creation, breathing in the very substance of sustenance, a seed was planted deep within him. This was not just a noisy, frightening place. It was a place of alchemy, where the hard, golden fruit of the earth was transformed into soft, life-giving powder. He looked at his father, now a flower ghost in the dim light, a deity of this dusty domain, and felt a surge of awe. This was his inheritance. This was his future. The scent of destiny was not of metal or glory, but of fresh ground flour, and it was a scent he would carry for the rest of his days. The weight of the sack. 7 years passed, their progression marked not by calendars, but by the turning of the great wheel and the cyclical demands of the seasons. The harvest sun of 1152 beat down upon Oakham, bleaching the thatch of the cottages and baking the mud of the track to a hard, cracked glaze. For Alaric, now 12, the mill was no longer a place of wonder, but a theater of unrelenting labor. His body, while still boyish lean, had begun to harden. The muscles in his arms and back, once soft, now corded with the constant strain of lifting, carrying, and sweeping. Today's task, one that left his hands raw and his spirit frayed, was helping his father unload Master Godric's wagon. Master Godric was one of the more prosperous peasants, holding a yardland of his own. His wheat harvest had been good, and his wagon, drawn by a single, patient ox, was piled high with sacks. Each sack, a bulky thing of coarse sacking, weighed a standard quarter sack, nearly 280 pounds. They were not made for boys to lift. "Take the end, Alaric! Heave!" Cedric's command was sharp, stripped of its former patience by the heat and the press of work. The queue of other villagers waiting with their grain stretched into the shade of the oak tree that gave the manor its name. Their faces were a mixture of sympathy and impatience. Alaric grunted, his fingers digging into the rough hemp of the sack. The weight was immense, a dead, shifting mass that threatened to pull his shoulders from their sockets. He staggered, his feet slipping on the flour-dusted wooden floor. The chaff from the grain sacking prickled his neck and found its way under his tunic, itching fiercely. Sweat poured down his temples, cutting clean lines through the layer of grime and flour that coated his skin. Together, father and son wrestled the sack onto the platform beside the millstones. Alaric's breath came in ragged gasps. He could smell the sour tang of his own sweat mingling with the dry, sweet smell of the wheat and the oily scent of the great wooden gears overhead. "You must find the balance, boy," Cedric grunted, not unkindly, but with the fatigue of a man who had done this 10,000 times. "It is not just strength, it is leverage. Your legs, your back, use them like a lever and a fulcrum. Your back is a straight pillar, or you will break it. A broken back is a death sentence here." Alaric nodded, too breathless to speak. He watched the next man in line, Old Man Aelred, a grizzled villager with a back bent like a drawn bow from a lifetime in the fields. Aelred's sack was smaller, his personal portion. His hands, gnarled like the roots of the great oak, trembled slightly as he handed over the grain toll to Cedric. The old man's eyes, milky with early cataracts, met Alaric's for a moment. They held a deep, weary resignation. "A good yield, Aelred," Cedric said, his voice regaining a measure of its warmth. "Aye," the old man croaked, "enough to see us through to the next, God and the weather willing." He glanced at the sky, a habitual, nervous tick of all who worked the land. When the last sack was stored and the last villager had trudged away, the real work began. The mill roared to life. Alaric's task was to mind the flow of grain into the millstone's eye, a job requiring constant attention. A blocked eye meant dry stones, which could spark and ignite the explosive flour dust. Too much grain, and the stones would choke. The quality of the flour would be coarse and uneven. His father moved around him, a blur of efficient motion. He tested the texture of the emerging flour between his thumb and forefinger, his head cocked to listen to the song of the machinery. He would adjust the gap between the stones with a subtle turn of the tentering screw, a critical device that raised or lowered the runner stone by a hair's breadth. "Closer for a finer flour for the Lord's table," Cedric explained, his voice raised above the din. "Wider for the coarse mash for the rest. We serve all, but we serve them differently." As the day wore on, the heat in the mill became oppressive. The air, thick with flour, was hard to breathe. Alaric's throat was parched, his eyes gritty. This was the reality of the mill. The romance of his childhood had been ground away, replaced by the aching reality of toil. He was not a magician, but a beast of burden in a dusty, noisy prison. At day's end, when the wheel was finally braked and the thunder subsided to a ringing silence, Alaric slumped against a stack of empty sacks. His body felt like one giant bruise. Cedric sat beside him, pulling a leathern bottle of small beer from a hiding place in the wall. He took a long swallow and handed it to his son. The beer was warm and slightly sour, but it was the most wonderful thing Alaric had ever tasted. It cut through the dust in his throat like a blessing. "You did well today," Cedric said, his voice quiet in the sudden stillness. "The work is hard. It will always be hard. But remember old man Elred? His back is broken from the field. Our backs may ache, but our work feeds 100 families. We are the hinge. The field grows the grain, the oven bakes the bread, but we are the vital turn between them. Without us, the wheat is just chicken feed." He placed a heavy, flour-whitened hand on Alaric's shoulder. "You felt the weight of the sack today. That is the weight of this community. It is a heavy burden, but it is an honorable one. Now come, your mother will have pottage for us, and tomorrow we do it all again." Alaric looked around the mill in the fading light. The settling flour dust gleamed in the twilight like a phantom shroud. The great millstones sat silent, their work done for the day. And in that moment of exhaustion and quiet camaraderie, he began to understand. The wait was not just a physical trial. It was a responsibility. It was a purpose. And for the first time, he did not shrink from it. The language of stone and stream. 3 more years folded into the landscape of Alaric's life, their passage measured in the accumulating layers of flour dust upon the mill's timber beams and the gradual broadening of his own shoulders. At 15, he stood on the cusp of manhood, no longer a child who assisted, but an apprentice who comprehended. The mill's chaos had resolved itself into a complex, predictable language. He learned to listen past the overwhelming roar, to distinguish the individual voices within the cacophony. His education moved beyond sacks and sweat into the realm of nuance. Cedric, recognizing the keen intelligence in his son's eyes, began teaching him the miller's true arts, the sciences of stone and water. One morning in early spring, when the wending ran high and fast with snowmelt, the mill's song was wrong. A rhythmic, percussive clunk had inserted itself into the usual grind and groan, a jarring note that set Alaric's teeth on edge. "Hear it?" Cedric asked, his head tilted, his eyes closed in concentration. He stood near the main gear pit, a dark, oily space where the great pit wheel meshed with the wallower on the vertical main shaft. "A strike," Alaric said, his own ears pinpointing the discordant sound. "Every third rotation. A damaged tooth on the pit wheel." A smile, rare and proud, touched Cedric's lips. "Good. Now, what does it mean?" "It means the force is uneven. It will strain the shaft, wear the bearing. If the tooth shatters, the gears could jam, and the torque could snap the shaft or break the wheel itself." "And the remedy?" "We must break the wheel, drain the race, and inspect the damage. A master carpenter and a blacksmith will be needed to forge and fit a new tooth. It is a day's lost work, maybe 2. Cedric nodded, his expression grim. "A day's lost work for us is a day closer to hunger for the village. But a broken mill is a year of hunger. We must be the physicians, Alaric. We diagnose the illness before the patient dies." This was a new kind of weight, Alaric realized. Not the physical strain of sacks, but the intellectual burden of maintenance, the constant vigilance against entropy. The mill was a living creature, its wooden bones and stone heart susceptible to age and injury. Later that week, with the repaired wheel turning true again, Cedric led him to the silent millstones. The machinery was still, the air unnaturally quiet. Cedric produced a set of tools that seemed almost sacred. A heavy iron mill bill with a sharp, chisel-like end and a smaller, lighter pick. "This," Cedric said, running a calloused thumb over the cutting edge of the bill, "this is how we speak to the stone." "The harps," he pointed to the radial grooves carved into the grinding faces, "must be sharp. They are the teeth that bite the grain, not crush it. Crushing makes a bitter flour, hot and spoiled. Biting shears the husk from the endosperm, making a sweet, cool, long-lasting meal." He demonstrated, positioning the bill against a dulled furrow on the stationary bedstone. With a precise, practiced tap of a wooden mallet, he struck the bill's head. A small, precise flake of granite chipped away. He did it again and again, moving along the groove with the patience of a monk illuminating a manuscript. The tink, tink, tink of the metal on stone was the mill's quiet heartbeat. "The pattern is everything," Cedric explained, his voice a low murmur in the hushed space. "The furrows are the roads the grain travels. They lead it to the land, the flat area at the stone's edge, where the final grinding happens. The balance of the roads and the lands, the depth of the cut, this is the miller's secret. It is the difference between flour that makes a lord's fine manchet loaf and grist that makes a peasant's dense, dark trencher." He handed the tools to Alaric. "Your turn. Feel the stone. Listen to its resistance. You are not breaking it. You are reminding it of its purpose." Alaric's first strike was clumsy, the bill skidding off the hard surface. The second was too hard, chipping a larger piece than intended. Cedric did not scold him. He simply placed his own large, steadying hand over Alaric's, guiding his movements. "Let the tool do the work. You are its guide, not its master." Slowly, a rhythm emerged. Tink, tink, tink. The sound was meditative. Alaric felt the unique texture of the granite through the metal, a gritty vibration. He saw how each tiny chip refined the groove, restoring its sharp, cutting edge. He was not merely maintaining a tool. He was engaging in a dialogue with the earth's own bones, persuading them to serve man's need. A profound respect for the material, for the craft itself, bloomed within him. This was alchemy, far more subtle than he had imagined. That evening, as they sharpened the last of the furrows, a young woman appeared at the mill door, a basket over her arm. It was Elara, the daughter of Godric the peasant. She was around Alaric's age, with hair the color of ripe barley and eyes the deep green of the forest moss. She had blossomed over the winter, and Alaric, suddenly aware of his own grimy state, felt a hot flush creep up his neck. "My father sent me," she said, her voice soft yet clear. "He wishes to know if his flour will be ready on the morrow." Her eyes flickered towards Alaric, a curious, appraising glance before settling on Cedric. "Aye, Elara, tell Godric it will be his finest yet. We've just given the stones a new voice," Cedric said, a knowing twinkle in his eye. She nodded, offered a small smile that seemed to brighten the dusty room, and departed. Alaric stood frozen, the mill bill hanging forgotten in his hand. The scent of her, a clean smell of soap and meadow herbs, lingered in the flower-thick air, a fragrance entirely alien and utterly captivating. Cedric chuckled, a low rumble. "The stones are not the only thing that needs a sharp edge, boy. A pretty face can dull a man's wits faster than a blunt millstone." Alaric bent back to his work, the tink, 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 now accompanied by the frantic beating of his own heart. He was learning the language of the mill, a tongue of wood, water, and stone. But now a new, more confusing and exhilarating dialect had introduced itself, the language of a young woman's smile, a sound for which the mill's roaring gears had left him entirely unprepared. The Lord's justice and the miller's due. The relationship between a miller and his community was a fragile tapestry woven from threads of dependence, resentment, and necessity. This truth was impressed upon Eric with the force of a physical blow during the Michael's audit in the autumn of his 17th year. The harvest had been mediocre, a damp summer leaving the grain thin in the head. A nervous energy permeated the village, a collective anxiety about the coming winter. In the mill, this tension manifested in the short tempers of the men who brought their meager yields and the sharp eyes of the Lord's steward, a gaunt, severe man named Malcolm. Malcolm arrived on a sleek, well-bred palfrey, his robes of dark wool a stark contrast to the homespun browns and grays of the peasants. He was accompanied by 2 men-at-arms, their chain-mail coifs glinting dully under the overcast sky. The audit was a ritual of power, a physical demonstration of where the true ownership of land, labor, and life resided. Alaric and his father had spent days preparing. Every sack of grain, every barrel of flour, every record of tolls taken was set in order. The Lord's share, 1/16 of all grain ground, was stacked separately in the granary, a tangible pyramid of the village's sweat. Malcolm dismounted, his thin lips pressed into a bloodless line. He did not greet them. He moved through the mill like a specter of judgment, running a white, uncalloused finger over the timbers, inspecting the gears, his expression perpetually disapproving. "The mill is in adequate condition, Cedric," Malcolm stated, his voice devoid of inflection. "The Lord William expects it to remain so. The rents from the mill are a vital part of his income. Any decline in productivity is a theft from his purse." "The mill is sound, Steward Malcolm," Cedric replied, his tone carefully neutral, his head slightly bowed. "The river provides, and we turn its gift to the Lord's service." Malcolm's eyes, pale and cold like a winter sky, fell upon the stacked sacks of the Lord's share. He walked over to them, and with a sudden, vicious motion, he plunged a long, thin brass rod, a grain probe, deep into one of the sacks. He pulled it out, the tip of the probe filled with a sample from the sack's core. He let the grains trickle into his palm. "The quality is acceptable," he conceded. Then his gaze swept over to the smaller piles belonging to the villagers, waiting to be collected. His eyes narrowed. "Cedric, the toll dish." Cedric brought forward the worn wooden bowl. Malcolm took it, holding it as if it were something unclean. He produced his own brass dish, identical in size, but gleaming, official. He walked to a villager's sack of rye, a pile belonging to Elred, and scooped a measure with the Lord's dish. He then poured it into the mill's toll dish. The grain mound in the wooden dish was noticeably lower. A deadly silence fell over the mill yard. The only sound was the chuckle of the river, and the caw of a distant crow. "This dish is worn, Cedric," said, his voice soft yet carrying like the whisper of a drawn blade. "Worn thin. A worn dish takes a lesser toll. Over a year, over 100 villagers, this worn dish represents a significant loss to Lord William. How long has this deficiency been occurring?" Alaric's blood ran cold. He had watched his father measure tolls his entire life. Cedric's measures were always heaping, often giving a handful extra to the old and the struggling. The dish was worn, yes, from decades of honest use. But the accusation hanging in the air was one of deliberate fraud, a crime punishable by a heavy fine, mutilation, or even death. Cedric's face was a stony mask. "The dish is the one given to me by the previous steward, my lord. It has known no other hand but mine. If it is worn, it is from long and faithful service, not from guile." "Faithful service?" Malcolm sneered. "A miller's faithfulness is measured in full measures for the Lord, not short measures for his friends." He turned to the men-at-arms. "Seize him." "No!" The word was out of Alaric's mouth before he could stop it. He stepped forward, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. All eyes turned to him. "The fault is not my father's. The dish, I used it to feed a family whose grain was blighted last winter. I spilled it and it cracked. I had a new one made, but the carpenter's mold was slightly large. The error is mine." It was a desperate, foolish lie, a tapestry of nonsense, but it was all he could conjure to shield his father. Malcolm turned his icy gaze upon Alaric. For a long, terrifying moment, he said nothing. The steward was not a fool. He saw the desperate love in the boy's eyes. He also saw an opportunity. "A son's loyalty is commendable," Malcolm said slowly, "but lies to a lord steward are a serious matter. Perhaps the fault lies not in the dish, but in the hand that holds it. Perhaps the mill requires a new hand, a younger, more precise hand." He was offering a bargain. Cedric's freedom for his position. Cedric understood instantly. "The error was mine, steward," he said, his voice thick with a defeated pride. "A moment of carelessness. It will not happen again. I will have a new dish carved to the official measure this very day, under your supervision." Malcolm considered this, drawing out the silence, savoring his power. "Very well," he said finally. "A fine of 1 silver penny will correct this carelessness, and the new dish will be sealed with the Lord's mark. See that it is done by week's end." The steward and his men mounted their horses and rode off, the crisis averted. The fine was a heavy blow, months of saved profit gone. But they were free, and the mill was still theirs. When they were alone, Cedric placed a hand on Alaric's shoulder. His grip was trembling, whether from fear or rage, Alaric could not tell. "That was a brave and stupid thing to do, boy," Cedric breathed. "Malcolm could have taken you for the levy, sent you to fight the Welsh for your impudence. Never interrupt the wolf while it is feeding. You simply make sure your own flock is secure. I could not let them take you, father." Cedric looked old, the lines on his face deeper than Alaric had ever seen them. "This is our life, Alaric. We walk a narrow path between the Lord's greed and the people's need. We are hated because we hold the power of their bread. We are envied because we have a trade. We are always suspected. Remember this day. Remember the weight of that silver penny. It is the price of our place in this world. Our due is not just the tolls we take, but the suspicion we bear. It is the miller's true tax. That night, Alaric did not dream of gears and flour. He dreamed of Malcolm's cold eyes and the gleaming, unforgiving brass of the official measure. He had learned the language of the stones and the water. Now he was learning the far more dangerous language of power. And he understood, with a chilling clarity, that his father's most critical skill was not dressing a millstone, but navigating the treacherous currents of human authority. The measure of a man. The silver penny, a tiny, cold disk of metal, became a specter that haunted the mill. Its absence was a physical void in the small locked chest where Cedric kept the mill's meager profits. For weeks, a pall of grim silence hung over father and son. The work continued, the wheel turned, the stones ground, but the easy camaraderie they had shared was replaced by a tense, unspoken acknowledgement of their vulnerability. Alaric watched his father with new eyes, seeing not just the strong miller, but a man bowed by invisible burdens. To pay the fine, Cedric took on work no self-respecting master miller would normally consider. He spent days in the forest with Alaric, their axes biting into the tough oak, cutting and hauling firewood to sell in the nearby market town. The labor was brutal, a different kind of ache that settled deep in the bones, a reminder that their tenure was precarious, their prosperity an illusion that could be shattered by a steward's whim. It was during this time of strained hardship that Alaric's understanding of his craft deepened in a new, more intuitive direction. He began to develop what the old millers called the feel. It started subtly. He would be monitoring the flow of grain, his hand resting lightly on the wooden hopper, and he would sense a minute change in the vibration coming from the stones below. It was not a sound, but a tremor, a slight hardening of the mill's constant hum. One afternoon, while Cedric was splitting wood behind the mill, this new sense screamed at him. The mill's song, to any other ear, was normal, but to Alaric, a new, almost imperceptible whine had threaded itself into the roar, a high-pitched keen that spoke of metal straining against wood. He acted without conscious thought. He slammed the grain gate shut and, with a strength born of panic, heaved on the great wooden brake lever, throwing his whole weight against it. The mill groaned in protest, the wheel shuddering to a violent, jarring halt. The sudden silence was deafening. Cedric came running, his face a mask of alarm and anger. "What in God's name are you doing? You could have snapped the brake arm. You'll jar the stones loose." Alaric, his heart still thundering, could only point a trembling finger towards the gear pit. "Listen," he gasped. In the new quiet, the sound was clear, a faint, steady drip, drip. Not water, something thicker. Cedric fetched a rushlight and lowered himself into the pit. A long minute passed. When he emerged, his face was pale beneath the grime. "The main bearing," he said, his voice hushed with a kind of awe. "The lignum vitae block. It's dry as a bone, overheating. The iron gudgeon on the shaft was starting to score it. Another hour, and the wood would have caught fire from the friction, or the shaft, seizing in the bearing, would have snapped like a dry twig." He looked at Alaric. His anger evaporated, replaced by a profound, searching curiosity. "How did you know? I heard nothing." Alaric struggled to explain the inexplicable. "I felt it. A new sound, a tightness, like a string pulled too taut." Cedric stared at him for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "The feel," he murmured. "My grandfather spoke of it. He said a true miller doesn't just hear his mill, he lives inside its skin. He feels his aches and pains before they become a fever. I have a little of it. You seem to have a gift." This incident marked a turning point. Cedric began to defer to Alaric's instincts. When Alaric suggested the mill race was silting up on the eastern bend, citing a slight lethargy in the wheel startup, Cedric organized a digging party and found a thick mattress of mud and debris. When Alaric noted a faint, gritty taste in the flour one Tuesday, he traced it to a tiny, almost invisible crack in the runner stone where grit from the wall was being introduced. His perception became the mill's early warning system. This newfound respect extended beyond the machinery. He began to notice the subtleties of the grain itself. He could run a handful of wheat through his fingers and, by the color, the plumpness, the feel of the husk, tell you which field it came from, how much sun it had seen, whether the soil was rich or poor. He could taste the flour and know if the stones were running too hot or too cold. One evening, as they shared a loaf of bread baked from their own flour, Cedric broke a long silence. "The penny was a heavy price," he said, staring into the fire. "But what you learned from that day, what you are becoming, that is worth more than a sack of silver. Malcolm can tax our coin, he can demand our labor, but he cannot tax this." He tapped a finger to his own temple, then over his heart. "This knowledge, this feel, that is your true inheritance. That is the measure of a miller, not the fullness of his purse, but the depth of his connection to his craft." Alaric understood. The Lord owned the mill, but the mill's soul, its living essence, belonged to the man who understood it. He was no longer just an apprentice following orders. He was becoming a partner, a guardian. The weight of the community, which had felt like a crushing burden during the audit, now felt like a solemn responsibility. He was learning to carry it not just with his back, but with his mind and his spirit. The phantom of the silver penny began to recede, replaced by the solid, growing confidence of a master in the making. The Heart's Harvest. The Michaelmas feast, coming after the tense audit, was a subdued affair in Oakham. Yet it was a necessary ritual, a brief respite from toil, a chance for the community to gather before the long, dark grip of winter. A great bonfire was lit in the center of the green, its flames licking at the chilly autumn air. The scent of roasting mutton and apples mingled with wood smoke. A traveling musician, his face leathery from the road, played a lively tune on a pipe, and a few of the younger villagers began to dance, their shadows leaping and twisting against the cottages. Alaric stood at the edge of the firelight, feeling strangely detached. The music, the laughter, the simple joy, it all seemed to belong to a world separate from the mill's perpetual grinding rhythm. He watched the dancers, his eyes unconsciously seeking one figure among them. He found her, Ilara. She was dancing with another youth, a freckled farmer's son named Liam, her barley-colored hair flying, her face flushed and bright with laughter. A sharp, unfamiliar pang, a mixture of longing and something darker, more possessive, twisted in Alaric's gut. He had spoken to her only a handful of times since she first came to the mill, brief, awkward exchanges about flour and collection times. Each time, he was left feeling clumsy and tongue-tied, the fine words he composed in the mill's solitude turning to dust in her presence. As the dance ended, Ilara, breathless and smiling, broke away from her partner and walked towards the trestle tables laden with ale. She passed close to where Alaric stood in the shadows. "The miller's shadow," she said, her voice playful. "Do you only emerge in full daylight like a mushroom?" Alaric felt his face grow hot. "The mill does not keep feast days," he managed to reply, his voice sounding rough and unused to his own ears. "No," she agreed, her smile softening, "but millers do, or they should. It is bad luck to be too married to one's work. The mill will still be there tomorrow, Alaric." She said his name. It was the first time she had ever used it, and it sounded like a secret on her lips. She picked up 2 wooden cups of ale and handed one to him. Their fingers brushed. Her skin was warm, a shocking contrast to the perpetual chill of the millstones. "You are quiet," she observed, taking a sip from her own cup. "I watch you sometimes when I come with my father. You are always listening, always watching the machinery. What do you hear in all that noise?" No one had ever asked him that. His father understood it as a practical matter. To everyone else, it was just noise. But she was asking about the soul of it. "I hear, it's health," he said, the words coming more easily now. "I hear the water's mood. I hear the stones talking to the grain. A happy mill has a deep, steady song. An unhappy one, it cries out." Ilara's green eyes were fixed on him, genuinely interested. "You speak of it like it's a living thing." "It is," he said, emboldened by her attention and the weak ale. "It has a heart that beats, bones that ache, a voice that speaks. You just have to learn its language." "And what is it saying now?" she asked, a teasing glint returning to her eyes. "It is complaining that I am here, enjoying myself, while it sits idle in the dark," Alaric said, and was rewarded with her laughter. It was a sound more melodic than any mill song, a clear, bright bell in the night. They talked then, truly talked. He told her of the time he felt the bearing fail. She told him of her love for the forest, for collecting herbs and mushrooms, of her secret fear of the vast open fields that made her feel so small. He learned that her mother had died in childbirth, that she kept house for her father and 2 brothers, that she dreamed of one day seeing the sea. He, in turn, spoke of more than the mill. He spoke of his mother, a quiet woman who had died of a fever when he was 10, whose memory was a gentle, faded picture in his mind. He confessed his fear during Malcolm's audit, his terror of losing everything. The words poured out of him, a dam breached by her simple, attentive presence. The bonfire burned low. The musician packed his pipe. Villagers began to drift away to their cottages. The magic of the evening was fading, but a new, warmer magic had taken root in Alaric's chest. As Ilara turned to leave, she paused. "The next time I come to the mill," she said, "do not just speak to me of flour. Speak to me of the mill's song. I should like to hear it." Then she was gone, melting into the darkness. Alaric stood alone, the empty cup still in his hand. The autumn chill was sharp, but he felt no cold. The memory of her laughter, the touch of her hand, the scent of her hair, meadow herbs and wood smoke wrapped around him like a cloak. He looked up at the sky where a million cold stars glittered and felt a connection to something vast and beautiful that had nothing to do with water or stone. He walked back to the dark, silent mill. He laid a hand on its familiar weather-beaten timbers. For the first time in his life, its silence felt like a comfort, not a void. It was waiting for him, its guardian, its voice. But now he had another song to listen for, a melody that promised a different kind of harvest, one not of grain, but of the heart. The mill was his duty, his burden, his craft. But Ilara was becoming his dream. The bargain and the blade. The truce with Steward Malcolm was a fragile thing, a thin sheet of ice over deep, cold water. Alarit felt its precariousness every time the steward's horse was sighted on the track. The memory of the silver penny was a lesson in power, but the following year brought a lesson in a different kind of economy, the economy of favors and unspoken agreements. It began with a poor harvest. A late frost had nipped the spring buds, and a dry summer had stunted the growth. The grain that came to the mill was thin, the kernels small and hard. The villagers' faces were etched with a deep-seated worry that no feast could erase. The Lord's share, when stacked, was a pitifully small pyramid, a sight that Alaric knew would displeasure Malcolm. When the steward arrived for his pre-harvest inspection, his expression was even more pinched than usual. He stalked through the mill, his gaze missing nothing. "The yield will be low this year, Cedric," Malcolm stated, his voice flat. "Lord William's expenses are not. The castle garrison must be paid. The Welsh marches are restless. The king demands his scutage. A low yield from the mill is an inconvenience we cannot afford." Cedric kept his head bowed. "We grind what the earth provides, steward. We cannot create grain from stone." "No," Malcolm agreed, his cold eyes sweeping over the machinery. "But you can ensure that every last kernel that comes to this mill is accounted for. And you can find other means of contribution." He let the words hang in the air. Then he turned and pointed a bony finger at Alaric. "The boy, he is of an age. The Lord is raising a levy to reinforce the border castles. Strong backs are needed. A season of service would be a fitting contribution from this mill. It would offset any potential shortfall in the tithe." Alaric's blood turned to ice. A levy! It meant being torn from the mill, from Ilara, from everything he knew. It meant marching to a foreign land to dig ditches, build walls, and face disease and, potentially, Welsh arrows. Many who went with a levy did not return. Cedric's posture stiffened. He did not look at Alaric. He kept his eyes fixed on Malcolm. "The mill requires 2 men, Steward Malcolm. You know this. The wheel is heavy. The sacks are heavier. Without my son, the grinding would slow to a trickle. Lord William's share would be even smaller." "Then you must work harder, old man," Malcolm replied without a shred of empathy. "Or find another boy. The levy the parts in a fortnight." It was a death sentence for the mill, and they all knew it. Cedric's shoulders, once so broad, seemed to sag under an impossible weight. He was about to speak, to plead, when Alaric, acting on an instinct as sharp as his feel for the mill, stepped forward. He did not address Malcolm. Instead, he looked his father in the eye, a silent plea passing between them. Then he turned to the steward. "Steward Malcolm," Alaric said, his voice steadier than he felt, "the mill is the life of this manor. A slow mill means hungry soldiers at the border as well as hungry villagers here. Sending me away saves a penny but costs a pound." Malcolm's eyebrow twitched upwards in faint surprise. "You lecture me on economics, miller's boy?" "I speak of value, my lord," Alaric pressed, his mind racing. "There is another way. The mill race silts up each year, stealing power from the wheel. The leat needs new reinforcing wattle to prevent a collapse in the spring floods. These are tasks that require a levy of men. Give me those men. For 1 week. Let me direct them. I will increase the efficiency of this mill by 1/10 part. I will wring more flour from less grain. The value of that increased yield year after year will far outweigh the value of 1 soldier for 1 season. Let the mill itself serve the Lord. The silence that followed was profound. Cedric was staring at him, his face a mixture of fear and dawning hope. Malcolm was scrutinizing him, his head tilted like a bird of prey considering a novel morsel. The steward was a man of numbers and assets. Alaric had not appealed to his mercy, but to his greed. He had offered him a permanent increase in revenue instead of a one-time conscription. 1/10 part? Malcolm said slowly. You guarantee this? I do, Alaric said, his heart hammering. He had no way of guaranteeing it, but his intimate knowledge of the mill's every weakness told him it was possible. Measure the tolls next year against this year's. If they have not increased, take me for the levy then. Malcolm was silent for a long minute, calculating. The mill was a vital asset. A more productive mill was a more valuable asset. A dead miller was of no value at all. Very well, the steward said finally. A bargain. You will have your levy of men for 1 week after the harvest is in. You will have your increased yield. If you fail, it will not be a levy that takes you. It will be a charge of fraud and the pillory. Do you understand the terms, miller's boy? I understand, Alaric said, his knees feeling weak. Malcolm nodded, turned on his heel, and left. When the sound of his horse's hooves had faded, Cedric let out a long, shuddering breath. He walked to Alaric and gripped his shoulders, his hands trembling. That was a dangerous game, he breathed. You bargained with a serpent. What choice did we have? Alaric replied, the full weight of his gamble settling upon him. The pillory, public humiliation, and likely a crippling fine afterwards. None, Cedric admitted. He looked at his son, a new, profound respect in his eyes. You did not confront the wolf. You offered it a larger sheep. That is a wisdom I do not possess. He shook his head. But now you must make good on your promise. The blade of your word is now at your own throat. The following week, when 6 sullen, conscripted villagers arrived, Alaric became a different person. He was no longer the quiet apprentice, but a commander. He directed the men with a firm, confident authority that surprised even himself. He had them dredging the mill race, deepening the channel, clearing every root and stone. He showed them how to weave a stronger, denser wattle from willow and hazel to reinforce the banks. He worked alongside them, his body straining, his mind constantly calculating flows and pressures. He was not just fixing the mill, he was optimizing it, tuning it like a musical instrument. He felt the truth of his promise in his bones. The wheel, when they finally cleared the last of the silt, turned with a freer, more powerful rhythm, its groan shifting to a deeper, more confident hum. He had avoided the blade of the levy by placing his own neck on the block of his word. The test was over. The judgment would come with the next year's harvest. As he watched the cleared water flow smoothly into the wheel, he felt a grim satisfaction. He had learned to navigate not just the currents of the river, but the even more treacherous currents of power. He had bartered not with coin, but with competence. And in doing so, he had begun to forge his own kind of authority. The Frost and the Flame. The winter that followed Alaric's bargain was the hardest Oakham had seen in a generation. It arrived not with a gentle snowfall, but with a savage, howling fury in late November. The wending river, which had always been the mill's lifeblood, became its prison and its mortal enemy. The cold was a physical entity. It seeped through the cracks in the mill's timber walls, laying a hoarfrost on the interior beams. The water in the leat froze, first into a thin, brittle skin, then into a solid, opaque plate of ice. The great water wheel became a monstrous sculpture of frozen spray, its timbers locked in a crystalline tomb. Without the flow of water, the mill was mute, its heart stilled. For the first time in Alaric's memory, the relentless noise ceased. The silence was profound, oppressive, and terrifying. It was the sound of suspended life, of income halted, of a community holding its breath. The villagers, their stores dwindling, looked towards the silent mill with a new kind of fear in their eyes. A frozen mill in spring was a nuisance. A frozen mill in the depths of winter was a catastrophe. Cedric and Alaric declared war on the ice. Their world shrank to the few yards around the mill. They took turns with a massive iron-tipped pole, swinging it like a battering ram against the ice. The impact sent jarring shocks up their arms, the sound a dull, hollow thud that echoed in the frozen air. Chips of ice flew, stinging their faces like tiny daggers. But the progress was agonizingly slow. For every inch they cleared, the relentless cold seemed to add 2 more. Their hands became raw and cracked, their breath pluming in great white gusts. They smeared animal fat on their faces to prevent frostbite, giving their skin a grotesque, greasy sheen. At night, they huddled by the small, meager fire in their living quarters, the cold so deep that the warmth barely reached a foot from the flames. The flour dust in the mill settled for the first time, leaving the air clear and brittle. It was during this siege of cold that Ilara proved her mettle. While others huddled in their cottages, she would appear at the mill door, a small bundled figure against the vast whiteness, carrying a covered pot. "My father sent this," she would say, her voice muffled by the woolen scarf wrapped around her face. The pot would contain a thin but hot rabbit stew or a peas pottage, a lifeline of warmth. She never stayed long, but her visits became a beacon in the unending gray of the winter. One particularly brutal afternoon, when a cutting wind whipped snow into blinding sheets, she arrived, her eyelashes frosted white. Alaric and Cedric were taking a desperate, shivering break, their energy spent. "This is foolishness," she said, her tone practical, her green eyes scanning the ice-locked wheel. "You are fighting the river itself. You will exhaust yourselves to death before you break its hold." "What choice do we have?" Alaric snapped, his patience frayed by cold and frustration. "The mill must turn." "Must it?" she asked, her gaze steady. "The river is sleeping. You cannot wake it by shouting. Perhaps you should listen to its silence for a change." Her words, so contrary to everything he knew, struck a strange chord. Later, as the weak sun began to set, casting long blue shadows across the snow, he found himself staring at the frozen wheel, not as an obstacle to be conquered, but as a problem to be understood. He walked away from the wheel, towards the head of the Leat, where the water was diverted from the main river. Here, the current was faster, and the ice was thinner. An idea, fragile and nascent, began to form. He remembered the feel, the connection to the water's mood. The river was not dead. Its power was merely trapped beneath the ice. "Father," he said, his voice hoarse, "we are attacking the wrong place." He explained his plan. Instead of trying to free the entire wheel, they would focus all their effort on the narrow channel where the water from the leat met the wheel's paddles. They would keep just that small section open, a vulnerable throat through which the river could still gasp. They built a small, sheltered fire on the bank, right at the lip of the leat, its heat directed at the ice. It was a tiny, pathetic flame against the immense cold, but it was constant. For 2 days and nights, they maintained their vigil, taking shifts to feed the fire and chip away at the reforming ice in that one critical spot. It was a battle of inches, a test of pure will. Alaric's world narrowed to the flickering of that flame, the sound of his own chipping, and the sight of a few inches of dark flowing water amidst the universal white. On the 3rd morning, a pale lemon-yellow sun broke through the clouds. Something changed. The air temperature rose, just a fraction. It was enough. The ice in the main river, under the slight warmth of the sun and the persistent, hidden pressure of the flowing water beneath, let out a deep, groaning crack that reverberated through the ground. Then another. It was the sound of the giant waking. With a series of shuddering, explosive reports, the ice on the wending began to break up. Great jagged plates, grinding against each other, were carried downstream. The force of the moving ice struck the frozen mill pond, shattering the surface ice like glass. The water, suddenly free, surged into the leat and slammed into the wheel. With a sound like 1,000 splintering trees, the ice encasing the wheel shattered. The great structure shuddered, groaned, and then, with painful slowness, it turned. One revolution, then another. It was sluggish, burdened with remnants of ice, but it was moving. The mill was alive. Alaric stood, exhausted, watching the wheel turn. He looked at Alara, who had come to stand beside him. Her face was illuminated by the rising sun, her expression one of quiet triumph. "You were right," he said, his voice a whisper. "We had to listen to the silence." She smiled. "The river and the mill are not your enemies, Alaric. They are your partners. Sometimes a partner needs to rest." In that moment, surrounded by the evidence of their shared struggle, something shifted between them. The playful flirtation of the feast solidified into a deeper, more profound bond. They had faced the abyss of winter together. He had seen her strength and her wisdom. She had seen his determination and his willingness to learn. The frozen silence had been broken not just by the turning of the wheel, but by the unspoken understanding that passed between them in the pale winter light. The flame they had kept alive on the bank was a mere echo of the one that now burned steadily between their two hearts. The proof in the grain. The thaw of 1158 was a slow, muddy affair. But to Alaric, it felt like a liberation. The world, once locked in monochrome, bled back into color. The brown of the churned earth, the defiant green of new shoots, the clear blue of the unburdened sky. Each hue was a victory. But the true test of their survival, and of Alaric's bold bargain with Malcolm, lay in the coming harvest. The memory of that frozen wheel haunted him. It was a stark reminder that his control over his destiny was an illusion, perpetually at the mercy of weather, lord, and river. The improvements to the mill race, now clear of silt and reinforced with stout new wattle, were his only shield. He watched the water flow with a critical eye, judging its speed, its power. The wheel did turn more freely. its voice a contented, powerful rumble instead of a labored groan. But would it be enough? When the first carts of the new harvest began to rumble into the mill yard, Alaric felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. The yield, while better than the previous year's disaster, was still modest. The kernels were good, plump and golden, but there were fewer sacks. He saw the same worry in the eyes of the villagers. They had survived the winter, but their resilience was worn thin. Cedric, his hair now more gray than brown, watched his son. He saw the intense focus with which Alaric monitored the stones, the way he adjusted the tentering screw with a surgeon's precision. His ear constantly tuned to the mill's song. He no longer offered advice. The mill was Alaric's charge now, his promise to uphold. Alaric pushed the machinery to its limits. He ran the stones closer, grinding the grain finer to extract every last ounce of flour. He used his feel to keep them at the perfect temperature, avoiding the scorched taste of overheated meal. He was not just grinding, he was performing an act of alchemy, a desperate transmutation of scant grain into ample flour. The air in the mill grew thick with the sweet, rich scent of his efforts, a perfume of hope and desperation. The day of the Michael Castle's audit arrived too soon. Malcolm came, as inevitable as the turning of the seasons, his palfrey picking its way through the churned mud of the yard. He did not dismount immediately. His cold eyes scanned the mill, the cleared race, the smoothly turning wheel. He offered no greeting. "The accounts," he demanded, holding out a pale hand. Cedric handed him the tally stick, notched with the record of every toll taken. Malcolm compared it to the stack of sacks that constituted the Lord's share. He spent a long time in silence, his fingers tracing the notches, his gaze flicking between the stick and the grain. The only sounds were the chattering of the river and the thrum of the mill. Alaric stood, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He could see the numbers in his mind. He had calculated them 100 times. It would be close, so very close. Finally, Malcolm looked up. His expression was unreadable. "The yield from the Manors fields is down," he stated, "yet the tolls recorded here are greater than last year's." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. Substantially greater. He dismounted slowly, his boots sinking into the mud. He walked to the Lord's share and plunged his grain probe into a sack of wheat. He examined the sample, letting it trickle through his fingers. He did the same with a sack of rye. He was testing for quality, for the fineness of the grind, for any sign of chaff or debris used to bulk it out. He found none. He turned to Alaric. "Your improvements," he said, his tone devoid of praise. "They yielded a 1/8 increase in efficiency, not a 1/10. Relief, so potent it made him lightheaded, washed over Alaric. He had done it. He had surpassed his own promise. "The river flows cleanly now, steward," Alaric said, his voice even. Malcolm's gaze was like a physical weight. "It seems the mill is in capable hands." The words were not a compliment. They were a reassessment. Alaric was no longer the boy. He was a factor to be calculated, an asset that had proven its worth. The threat of the levee, the shadow of the pillory, evaporated like mist in the morning sun. "The bargain is fulfilled," Malcolm declared. He mounted his horse. "See that it remains so." With a final, inscrutable glance, he turned his horse and rode away. his men-at-arms following. When he was gone, the tension broke. Cedric let out a long, shaky breath and leaned against the mill door, his face crinkling into a weary smile. "By all the saints, boy, you did it!" But Alaric felt no triumph, only a deep, bone-weary satisfaction. He had not won a victory. He had secured a permanence. He had proven that his value lay not in his strong back for a levy, but in his keen mind for the mill. "The bargain is fulfilled," Malcolm declared. He mounted his horse. "See that it remains so." With a final, inscrutable glance, he turned his horse and rode away, his men-at-arms following. When he was gone, the tension broke. Cedric let out a long, shaky breath and leaned against the mill door, his face crinkling into a weary smile. "By all the saints, boy, you did it!" But Alaric felt no triumph, only a deep, bone-weary satisfaction. He had not won a victory. He had secured a permanence. He had proven that his value lay not in his strong back for a levy, but in his keen mind for the mill. He had bought his place in the world not with a silver penny, but with a mountain of golden flour. That evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and purple, Ilara came to him. She did not bring food or excuses. She simply came, standing beside him as he watched the water flow. "I heard," she said softly. "The whole village is talking. You saved yourself." "I saved the mill," he corrected her, his eyes still on the water. "They are the same thing." She nodded, understanding him perfectly. "My father says we have not had flour this good in years. He says it is like the bread of his childhood." Her words were the true reward, more meaningful than Malcolm's grudging acknowledgement. He had fed his people, and he had done it well. He turned to look at her. In the twilight, her face was soft, her eyes full of a quiet pride that warmed him more than any fire. "The frost is past," she whispered. "Aye," he replied, his hand finding hers in the gathering dusk. "The frost is past." The proof was not just in the grain, or the tally stick, or the steward's retreat. It was in the feel of her hand in his, in the steady, reliable turn of the wheel, in the knowledge that he had met the world's harshness with his own skill and had, for now, prevailed. He was Alaric, the miller, and the mill was his. The whispers in the rye. Prosperity in a medieval village was a relative and dangerous state. A full belly could breed as much trouble as an empty one. The success of the mill, so vital to the community, began to cast a long, ambiguous shadow. The increased efficiency that had saved Alaric from the levy also meant that the sight of flour-dusted sacks leaving the mill was a more common occurrence. And where there was plenty, there was also envy. The whispers started subtly, like a damp rot in the mill's timbers. Alaric first noticed it in the changed demeanor of the villagers. The gratitude in their eyes after the hard winter had been genuine, but as the memory of hunger faded, it was replaced by a more complex emotion. The nods of respect were sometimes a little too slow, the greetings a little too guarded. He heard the first direct whisper one market day. He was delivering a sack of fine ground flour to the baker, a man named Harold, whose loaves were the best in the parish. As he passed two old women haggling over a chicken, he caught a fragment of conversation, his name snagged in it like a burr. "Aye, the mill turns well for the miller's son, does it not? His purse grows fat while our grain shrinks." The other woman cackled. "A miller's thumb is always heavy on his own side of the scale. 'Tis the way of the world." Alaric froze, a hot flush of anger and injustice rising in his chest. The miller's thumb, the ancient accusation that millers used a trick of weighing to steal grain. He had taken such pains to be scrupulously fair, to often give a scant measure back to the poorest families. To hear the old slander applied to him felt like a physical blow. He confronted his father that evening. "They say we cheat them. After the winter, after everything, they whisper about the miller's thumb." Cedric did not seem surprised. He sat by the hearth, slowly carving a new tentering handle from a piece of ash wood. "Of course they do," he said, his voice calm. "It is easier to believe a man is a thief than to believe he is simply more clever. We live on the edge of their world, Alaric. We are not of the fields, and we are not of the manor house. We are in between, and those in between are always suspected." "But it is a lie," Alaric insisted, his voice tight with frustration. "Is it?" Cedric asked, looking up, his eyes glinting in the firelight. "We do not starve in a lean year. We have a solid roof, a trade that cannot be taken from us by a hailstorm. To a man who breaks his back on a strip of land that may or may not feed his children, that looks like theft. Our very survival is proof of our guilt in their eyes." The logic was cruel and inescapable. Alaric felt the isolation of his position keenly. He was the hinge, as his father had said, but a hinge is perpetually strained, pressed from both sides. The whispers found a more malicious voice in the form of a man named Boren. Boren was a newcomer to Oakham, a runaway serf from a northern manor, or so it was rumored. He was a large, surly man with a talent for physical labor and a deep-seated resentment for anyone in a position of even minor authority. He had taken up with a widow on the edge of the village and worked her land with a brutal efficiency. Boren began bringing his grain to the mill, and from the first he was a source of conflict. He watched the measuring of the toll with a hawk's intensity, his small, dark eyes missing nothing. "That dish looks worn, Miller," he grunted on his second visit, his voice a low challenge. "It is the official measure, sealed by the steward himself," Alaric replied, keeping his tone neutral. Boren merely snorted, a sound of pure disbelief. When Alaric poured the measured toll into the lord's sack, Boren shouldered his own diminished sack and muttered, just loud enough for Alaric to hear, "Aye, the lord's measure and the miller's measure. Two different things, I'll wager." Alaric felt the eyes of the other villagers in the queue upon him. He said nothing. A confrontation would only lend credence to the man's insinuations. But the poison was seeping into the community. He saw others, who had once been friendly, now watching the measuring process with a new, suspicious scrutiny. The final straw came when Godric, Ilara's father, came to him privately. The good-natured peasant looked troubled. "Alaric," he began, awkwardly shuffling his feet, "it is not my place, but there is talk. Boren is saying that the flour from his last grinding was short, that the sack was lighter when he got it home." Alaric's temper, worn thin by the constant suspicion, finally frayed. "And you believe him? You, who have known me since I was a boy trailing after my father." Godrith looked pained. "I believe what I see, and I see a man who stirs a pot until it boils over. Be careful, Alaric." A community's trust is like a millstone. It grinds slow and true, but once it is cracked, it can never be fully mended. That night, Alaric climbed to the loft above the milling room and looked out the small window over the sleeping village. The moon silvered the thatched roofs. It was a scene of profound peace, but he felt only a cold loneliness. He had fought the river, the ice, and the Lord's steward. But how did one fight a whisper? How did he defend himself against an enemy that was not a man, but a shadow, a rumor, a seed of doubt planted in the fertile soil of fear and envy? The mill's wheel turned, powering the life of the village, but the very heart that kept it beating was now under siege from the people it served. The whispers in the rye were a more insidious threat than any frozen winter, and he had no tool, no lever to make them stop. The unseen fulcrum. The weight of the village's suspicion settled upon Alaric's shoulders, a burden far heavier than any sack of grain. It was a cold presence in the mill, a chill that the heat of grinding and the summer sun could not dispel. He went about his work with a grim, mechanical efficiency. His feel for the mill now extended to the mood of every person who crossed its threshold. He could sense the hesitation in a man's step, the averted gaze, the overly careful politeness that masked distrust. Boren, the surly newcomer, became the fulcrum of this discontent. He was a man who understood the leverage of grievance. He did not shout his accusations. He let them simmer, dropping them into conversations like a poison into a well. He would stand in the queue, his massive arms crossed, and say to no one in particular, "Strange how a miller's cottage never wants for a new thatch, even in a lean year." Or, "The Lord's men count the sacks, but they do not count the flour dust that clings to a miller's clothes. A man could sweep a pound from his floor each night." Alaric knew that to confront Boren directly would be to validate him. To make the private whispers a public debate he could not win. Proof of his honesty was intangible, while the suspicion was a solid, growing thing. He felt trapped, his reputation being ground to dust as surely as the grain between his stones. His only solace was Ilara. She came to him one evening, finding him sharpening the mill bills with a furious, focused energy. "They are fools," she stated, her voice firm, brooking no argument. She placed a hand on his arm, stilling his frantic motion. "My father knows it. I know it. The good people in this village know it in their hearts, but fear is a louder voice than reason." "What would you have me do?" Alaric asked, the frustration boiling over. "Invite them all to watch me weigh every measure? They would still say I had a hidden weight, a trick of the hand. A man who decides you are a thief will see proof of it in your every breath." "Then you must be smarter than their suspicion," she replied, her green eyes holding his. "You cannot fight the whisper, Alaric, but you can make it irrelevant. You must become so essential, so unquestionably valuable, that the whisper seems petty and foolish even to the one who speaks it." Her words echoed his father's philosophy, but they offered a path forward, not just an explanation. He could not defend himself against a ghost, but he could build something so solid the ghost could not haunt it. The opportunity to build came sooner than expected. A fever swept through the village, a sweating sickness that left the strong weak and the weak in their graves. It struck indiscriminately, felling the Lord's swineherd and the freeman farmer alike. The harvest work slowed to a crawl, and a new, more primal fear gripped Oakham. Then, Boren's widow, the woman he lived with, fell ill. Her name was Agnes, a quiet, worn woman who had always been polite to Alaric. Boren, for all his bluster, was terrified. He was a laborer, not a healer. He had no knowledge of herbs, no means to comfort her beyond brute presence. Alaric saw his chance. It was Ilara who provided the means. She was known in the village for her knowledge of woodland plants, often providing poultices and tisanes for minor ailments. But this fever was beyond her simple remedies. "There is a plant," she told Alaric, her voice low and serious, "masterwort. It grows in the high, damp clearings deep in the forest, near the old stones. The wise woman who taught my mother swore by it for breaking fevers. But the place is far, and the way is treacherous." The old stones were a place of superstition, a crumbling circle from a time before memory. Most villagers avoided it. "I will go," Alaric said without hesitation. He left before dawn, the mill silent for the day. He took a stout staff and a knife, moving through the forest with a woodsman's quiet grace, a skill learned from his forays for timber. The air was thick and still under the canopy, the path faint and overgrown. He felt the weight of the ancient trees, the watchful silence of the deep wood. It was a different world from the noisy, flower-filled mill, a world of patient, slow-growing power. After hours of walking, he found the clearing. The old stones stood gray and lichen-covered, squatting in a circle like sleeping giants. And there, in the damp soil at their feet, grew the masterwort, its clusters of white flowers like tiny stars against the dark green leaves. He harvested a careful bundle, respecting the plant and the place. When he returned, filthy and weary, he went not to his own home, but to Boren's cottage. He handed the herbs to Alara, who was already there, trying to cool Agnes's fevered brow. He did not speak to Boren, who stood in the corner, his face a storm of conflicting emotions, fear, pride, and a dawning, uncomfortable shame. Ilara prepared a decoction, forcing the bitter liquid between Agnes's lips. For a day, there was no change. Then, on the second day, the fever broke. The woman would live. Alaric had not done it for gratitude. He had done it because it was the right thing to do, and because it was the only weapon he had. But the effect on the village was immediate and profound. The man they had suspected of stealing their grain had ventured into a feared place to save the life of the woman who shared the bed of his chief accuser. The whispers did not stop overnight, but their tone changed. Now, when Boren muttered about the miller's thumb, he was met with silence, or even a sharp retort. "Aye, and his thumb pulled Agnes from the grave, did it not? Hold your tongue, Boren." Alaric had become the unseen fulcrum. He had leveraged an act of simple, dangerous decency against the weight of suspicion. He had not denied the accusation, he had rendered it meaningless. The community's trust, which Godric had warned him was like a cracked millstone, began slowly to mend. The crack was still there, a memory of the fracture, but the stone could still turn, could still grind. And in the quiet gratitude in Boren's eyes the next time he brought his grain, a look that held no words, but a world of understanding, Alaric knew he had won a victory more significant than any against Steward or Winter. He had secured his place not through fear or efficiency, but through an unassailable act of belonging. The breaking storm. The mended trust with the village brought a new, fragile peace to Alaric's life, a peace that allowed another, more tender shoot to grow. His courtship of Ilara, once conducted in stolen moments and furtive glances, now blossomed in the open air. He would walk with her along the riverbank after Sunday Mass, their conversation easy and flowing like the water beside them. He learned the names of all her herbs, and she, in turn, learned to listen for the subtle changes in the mill's song, understanding this was the language of his soul. It was during a late summer evening, with the air warm and heavy with the scent of hay and meadowsweet, that he led her to the heart of his world. The mill was still, the wheel braked for the night. Fireflies danced in the twilight over the mill pond like scattered embers. "Come," he said, his voice soft. He took her hand and guided her inside, into the deep, resonant silence of the slumbering giant. In the darkness, the mill felt immense, a cathedral of industry. Moonlight streamed through the high window, illuminating the great millstones in a silvery glow. The furrows in the granite looked like sacred writing. "This is where I live," he whispered, the sound swallowed by the vast, quiet space. "Not in the cottage, here." He guided her hand to the cool, rough surface of the bedstone. "This stone has been here for 60 years. It has ground enough flour to feed this village for 2 generations. It has known drought and flood, good harvest and bad." He moved her hand to the wooden hopper, to the iron-shod gears. "This is my legacy. This noise, this dust, this unending turn. It is not a rich man's legacy, but it is a true one." Ilara did not speak. She let her fingers trail over the machinery, feeling the history, the toil, the essence of him embedded in the very wood and stone. She understood that this was more than a profession. It was his identity, his covenant with the world. He turned to face her, his features stark and handsome in the monochrome light. "Ilara," he began, his voice thick with an emotion that threatened to choke him. "I have nothing to offer you but this noise, this dust, this life bound to the river's mood. I cannot promise you riches or ease. I can only promise you a place here, beside me. I can promise you that I will tend to this mill and to you with every skill I possess, with every breath in my body." He fumbled in the pouch at his belt and brought out a small, smooth object. It was a river stone, dark gray and worn perfectly oval by the water's endless caress. In the moonlight, tiny flecks of mica embedded within it sparkled like trapped stars. "It is not silver or gold," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It is a piece of the river, a piece of the mill. It is a piece of me. Will you have it? Will you have me?" Tears glistened in Ilara's eyes, catching the moonlight. She did not take the stone immediately. Instead, she reached up and placed her hand against his cheek, her touch cool and sure. "I do not want a life of ease, Alaric," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I want a life of purpose, and there is more purpose in this mill than in any silent, empty hall." She closed her fingers over the river stone, its solid, water-worn shape fitting perfectly in her palm. "Yes," she whispered, "I will have you, and I will have this mill, and together we will make it sing." He kissed her then, in the heart of his dusty, noisy kingdom, now a place of profound and sacred quiet. It was a sealing of their pact, a union of the miller and the healer, of stone and leaf, of the grinding wheel and the flowing stream. Their joy, however, was short-lived. The breaking storm was not a metaphor. It arrived 2 days later, heralded by a sickly green sky and an oppressive, unnatural heat. The birds fell silent. The air grew still, heavy with impending violence. When the storm hit, it was with a fury that seemed biblical. The sky tore open, not with rain, but with a deluge of hail, stones the size of hen's eggs that battered the thatched roofs of Oakham into shreds. Then the wind came, a shrieking demon that tore branches from the great oak and sent tiles flying from the manor house roof. Alaric and Cedric barred the mill door, listening to the fury outside. But their true fear was not for the building, but for the river. The rain, when it followed the hail, was torrential, a solid wall of water that fell for hours. By morning, the Wending was unrecognizable. It was a raging brown monster, overflowing its banks, swallowing fields and pastures. It clawed at the wattle reinforcements of the leat, tearing them away like straw. The mill pond, usually a placid mirror, was a churning, debris-filled cauldron. The greatest terror was the sound, a deep, grinding roar that grew louder every minute. Alaric, standing at the door, his face pressed to a crack, all awa see it coming. A great oak tree, its roots torn from the sodden earth upstream, was riding the flood like a battering ram. It was moving directly towards the mill's water wheel. "There's no time!" he yelled to his father. "The tree!" They were powerless. They could only watch as the massive trunk, its branches like 100 spears, slammed into the wheel. The sound was a sickening, splintering crack, louder than any thunder. The great wheel, the heart of the mill for half a century, shuddered, groaned, and then shattered. Timbers exploded, the central axle snapped, and the wreckage was swallowed by the raging water. The roaring of the flood filled the sudden, terrible silence. The mill was dead. Not sleeping, like in the winter, but murdered. Its heart had been torn out. Alaric stood frozen, staring at the gaping hole where the wheel had been, at the brown, violent water surging through. The world he had built, the future he had just promised to Alara, had been shattered in an instant. The storm had passed, leaving clear skies and devastation in its wake. The grinding wheel of time had stopped, and Alaric did not know if he had the strength to make it turn again. The stillness of ruin. The silence was the most terrible sound Alaric had ever heard. It was not the peaceful quiet of a winter's night or the respectful hush of a halted machine. This was a void, an absolute absence where the mill's vital, thrumming presence had been. The only noises were the gurgle and suck of the receding floodwaters and the occasional drip of moisture from the broken roof, where hailstones had punched through the thatch. The air, once vibrant with the scent of fresh flower and warm stone, now stank of river mud, rot, and splintered wood. He stood ankle-deep in cold, oozing silt, staring at the wreckage. The massive oak trunk, the instrument of their destruction, was lodged in the shattered remains of the race, a tombstone for the water wheel. What was left of the wheel itself was a grotesque tangle of splintered timber and twisted metal. The great iron axle, the mill's backbone, was snapped clean through, its broken ends gleaming dully in the gray morning light. The power, the life, was gone. Cedric moved beside him, his steps slow, his face a mask of stunned grief. He reached out a trembling hand and laid it on a splintered piece of the wheel, a gesture comparable to a father touching the cold cheek of a dead child. He did not speak. No words existed for this. The news spread through Oakham like the floodwaters themselves. Villagers began to gather on the high ground above the mill, their faces pale with a new kind of horror. A broken mill in winter was a trial. A destroyed mill was an existential threat. Their stores of grain were meant for grinding, not for boiling into miserable porridge. The specter of hunger, so recently banished, now loomed larger than ever. Lord William's steward, Malcolm, arrived within the hour. He surveyed the damage from his horse, his expression not of sympathy, but of cold calculation. "A catastrophe," he pronounced, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. "The mill is the Lord's property. Its destruction is a loss to his estate." His gaze fell upon Cedric and Alaric. You are its keepers. Its maintenance was your charge. This failure lies at your feet. The injustice of the accusation was a physical blow. They had maintained the mill with their very souls. They had fought ice and silt and age. They could not fight a fallen tree hurled by a biblical storm. "What would you have us do, steward?" Cedric asked, his voice hollow. "We cannot command the weather." "You can command your diligence," Malcolm retorted. "The mill must be rebuilt. The Lord will provide the timber from his forests. But the labor is your responsibility. You will oversee its reconstruction. You will bear the cost of the skilled craftsman, the carpenter, the blacksmith. And until the mill turns again, the Lord's tithe of grain will be taken from your personal stores and your future earnings. You will repay this debt with your labor and your livelihood." The injustice was a sentence of servitude. They were to become slaves to the wreckage, their lives mortgaged to rebuild what the river had taken. The silver penny fine had been a wound. This was an amputation. The following days were a descent into a new kind of toil. The initial, back-breaking work was clearing the debris. Alaric, his father, and a handful of villagers conscripted by the steward, Boran among them, his earlier resentment replaced by a grim, shared purpose, waded into the cold mud. They hauled out splintered timbers, rocks, and the stinking detritus the flood had left behind. The physical labor was punishing, but the psychological weight was worse. Every splintered piece of oak he carried was a piece of his own broken future. Alara came every day, not as a betrothed, but as a quartermaster. She organized the women to bring food and ale. She cleaned and bandaged their hands when they were torn and raw from the work. She said little, but her presence was a steady flame in the overwhelming damp and despair. She would catch Alaric's eye across the ruin, and in her gaze he saw not pity, but a fierce, unwavering faith. It was the only thing that kept him from surrendering to the mud. At night, slumped by a meager fire, Alaric and Cedric would pore over the problem. The destruction was total. It was not a repair, it was a birth. "The wheel," Cedric muttered, staring into the flames. "The old design, it was strong, but it was slow. The pitch of the paddles, it could have been better. It could have been stronger." A spark, faint and guttering, flickered in the darkness of Alaric's mind. He saw the broken axle, the shattered paddles. He remembered the relentless power of the flood, the way it had seized the old wheel and destroyed it with contemptuous ease. "Stronger," Alaric repeated, his voice a dry rasp, "but also smarter." He stood up, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. He found a piece of charred wood from the fire and began to draw on a flat stone. Not the old simple wheel, a new design. A wheel with a curved, shrouded breastwork to direct the water's force more efficiently. A wheel with paddles set at a steeper pitch to capture more of the current's power, to start more easily under a heavy load. A wheel whose hub and spokes could be reinforced with iron bands forged by the blacksmith. Cedric leaned over, his eyes narrowing as he studied the rough sketch. This is different. It is more complex. The carpenter will complain. The cost is already our lives, Father, Alaric interrupted, a desperate passion in his voice. If we are to be slaves to this debt, let us build something worthy of it. Let us build a mill that is not just restored, but reborn. A mill that can withstand the river's rage. A mill that is our answer to this ruin. He was no longer looking at a broken wheel. He was seeing its successor. The stillness of the ruin was absolute, but in his mind, a new, more powerful rhythm was beginning to beat. The storm had taken everything, but in the void it left behind, an idea was taking root. They would not just rebuild, they would reimagine. The forge of a new will. The design, scrawled in charcoal on stone, became their manifesto. It was a declaration of war against the ruin, a promise that the response to destruction would not be mere replication, but evolution. Convincing others of this vision, however, was its own battle. The first skirmish was with the carpenter, a grizzled old master named Orvin, whose father had built the original wheel. Orvin arrived, his tools slung over his shoulder, and stared at Alaric's drawing with deep skepticism. "Curved breastwork?" he grunted, scratching his grizzled chin. "A folly. The water pushes, the wheel turns. Why complicate God's own design? And this pitch, it will strain the gears. The old way is the proven way." "The old way is lying in splinters at the bottom of the race," Alaric replied, his tone respectful but firm. He pointed to the drawing. "The breastwork focuses the flow. It is like cupping your hand to scoop water. You get more force with the same effort. The steeper pitch will make the wheel turn faster with less water, useful in a dry summer. We are not just building for now, Master Orvin. We are building for the next flood, for the next drought." Orvin peered at him, his eyes sharp under bushy white brows. He was a man who respected craft, not fancy. But he saw the intelligence in the design, the understanding of hydrodynamics that went beyond tradition. He ran a calloused finger over the charcoal lines. "The joinery, it would be harder. The angles are tricky. It would take more time." "Time is the one thing the steward has given us," Cedric said wryly. Orvin was silent for a long moment. Then a slow grin spread across his weathered face. "A challenge? It has been a long time since I had a proper challenge. Very well, miller's boy. We will build your new-fangled wheel. But if it fails, the laughter will be on your head, not mine." The next challenge was the blacksmith, a massive, soot-blackened man named Ivor, who spoke rarely and hammered with a rhythm that shook his entire forge. Alaric brought him the design for the iron bands to reinforce the hub and the new, thicker axle. "Iron is costly," Ivor stated, his voice a low rumble like his own bellows. "The ore, the charcoal, this is not a peasant's billhook. This is a king's ransom in metal. The cost will be added to our debt with the steward," the words tasting like ash. "But without the iron, the wheel may not survive the next test. The strength of the mill depends on the strength of its heart. You are the one who can give it that strength." Ivor looked from the drawing to Alaric's resolute face. He gave a single sharp nod. "I will make it strong. It will be a wheel for the ages." And so the work began in earnest. The mill site, once a place of rhythmic industry, became a chaotic, noisy shipyard. The scent of fresh sawn oak from Orvin's adze and plane replaced the smell of flour. The ringing of Ivor's hammer on the new axle from the forge down the lane was a new, hopeful percussion. Boren and the other conscripted men, under Alaric's direction, began rebuilding the stonework of the damaged mill race, shaping it to accommodate the new, curved breastwork. Alaric was everywhere. He was no longer just a miller. He was an architect, a foreman, a diplomat. He mediated disputes between Orvin and the laborers, calculated the precise angles for the new stonework, and spent hours at Ivor's forge watching the white-hot iron being shaped, ensuring the dimensions were perfect. He slept little, his mind racing with calculations, his body aching with a new, different fatigue. Ilara was his constant support. She brought him food, forced him to rest, and listened as he talked through problems, her practical mind often offering a simple solution he had overlooked in his complexity. One evening, as they sat together on a stack of new timbers, watching the stars appear over the skeletal frame of the new wheel, she took his hand. "You are changing," she said softly. "I am tired," he confessed. "It is more than that," she insisted. "Before the flood, you were the mill's keeper. You understood its soul. Now, you are becoming its creator. You are not just listening to its song anymore, Alaric. You are composing a new one." Her words struck a deep chord within him. She was right. The destruction had shattered his identity, which was bound to the old mill. In its place, he was forging a new one, not through passive inheritance, but through active, determined creation. He was applying his feel, his deep, intuitive understanding, not to maintenance, but to genesis. The project was not without setbacks. A supporting timber cracked under a test load. The first casting of the axle had a hidden flaw and had to be melted down and reforged, a costly delay. Each problem was a fresh turn of the screw on their debt, a reminder of the yoke around their necks. But with each problem solved, the new structure rose. The curved breastwork took shape, a smooth, elegant sweep of stone and timber. The new wheel, its spokes and felloes fashioned from the heart of mighty oaks, began to be assembled. It was a colossal, beautiful thing, a testament to human ingenuity rising from nature's chaos. The day the new iron-shod axle was fitted into the great bearings was a solemn ceremony. Orvin, Ivor, Cedric, and the laborers stood watching as the massive piece of metal, gleaming and potent, was settled into place. It was the spine of the new mill. Alaric laid a hand on the cool, forged iron. He could feel the potential within it, the captured power of the forge, the promise of motion. The stillness of the ruin was finally being filled, not with the old, familiar noise, but with the palpable anticipation of a new beginning. The forge of their will had tempered them in fire and hammered them into a new shape. They were no longer just survivors of a disaster. They were the architects of a resurrection. The new wheel was not yet turning, but Alaric could already hear its future song, a deeper, stronger, more resilient melody than the one the flood had silenced. The first turn. The air on the day of the launching was thick with a tension far heavier than flour dust. It was the culmination of months of back-breaking labor, of despair transformed into determination, of a debt that had become a crucible. The entire village of Oakham had gathered on the banks above the mill, their collective breath held. This was not merely the restarting of a machine. It was the resuscitation of their community's heartbeat. The new wheel stood immense and silent, a giant poised at the edge of the mill race. Its oak timbers, fresh-hewn and pale gold, were stark against the dark stone of the new breastwork. The iron bands around its hub gleamed with a dull, potent sheen in the morning sun. It was a fusion of forest and forge, a creature of both nature and man's ambition. To Alaric, it was the physical manifestation of his own transformed will. He stood with his father, Orvin the carpenter, and Ivar the blacksmith. The four of them formed a silent council before the sluice gate, the great wooden barrier that held back the river's power. Cedric's face was a landscape of weary hope. Orvin's was set in lines of professional scrutiny, his eyes searching for any flaw in his work. Ivar's soot-streaked countenance was impassive, but his massive hands were clenched at his sides. "Ready?" Cedric's voice was a hoarse whisper, barely audible over the chuckling water in the race. Alaric nodded, his throat too tight for speech. He looked up at the crowd, his gaze finding Alara. She stood with her father, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her expression serene but her knuckles white. She gave him a single, slow nod. It was time. He moved to the sluice gate mechanism. It was a new design as well, a heavier, more robust windlass. He fitted the wooden bar into its socket. Orvin and Ivar stepped forward to join him, their hands gripping the polished wood. Together, the three of them, the miller, the carpenter, the smith, began to turn it. The mechanism protested at first, its newness making it stiff. The wood groaned, the gears clunked. Then, with a shudder, the sluice gate began to rise. A thin sheet of water spilled over the top, then a torrent. The pent-up energy of the wending river surged into the newly sculpted race, guided and focused by the curved breastwork. The water hit the wheel's paddles with a force that was both physical and audible, a deep, wet thwomp. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. The wheel, immense and heavy, resisted. The collective hope of the village seemed to falter. Then a groan emanated from the very core of the structure. It was not the pained complaint of the old wheel, but the deep, resonant protest of a giant being roused from sleep. The great iron axle shifted in its bearings. The wheel moved, an inch, then another. Its rotation was agonizingly slow at first, the water sluicing off the steeply pitched paddles. "Come on," Alaric whispered, his muscles straining as if he could push the wheel himself through sheer force of will. "Turn." And then it did. The wheel found its rhythm. The initial sluggish resistance gave way to a smooth, powerful rotation. The groaning settled into a low, confident hum that vibrated through the timbers of the mill and up through the soles of their feet. It was a deeper, more substantial sound than before, a bass note that spoke of immense harnessed power. A cheer erupted from the villagers, a raw, explosive sound of pure relief and joy. Hats were thrown into the air, children danced. But Alaric's work was only half done. The wheel turned, but the mill was not yet grinding. He turned from the spectacle and ran into the mill, his father on his heels. Inside, the familiar machinery was waiting. The pit wheel, connected to the great axle, was already turning, its wooden teeth engaging the wallower on the vertical shaft. Power was translating upwards. Alaric scrambled to the stone floor, his eyes fixed on the great spur wheel that now began to spin, transferring its energy to the stone nuts. This was the moment of ultimate truth. The gears were new, the alignment untested. A miscalculation, a fraction of an inch off, and the new teeth would shatter themselves against each other in a catastrophic failure. He watched, his heart in his throat, as the machinery engaged. There was a series of solid, satisfying clunks as the gears meshed. The vertical shaft turned, the great iron rind at its base began to spin. And finally, the runner stone, the cotillus, lifted from its bed and began to rotate. It was perfect. The balance was true. The stones turned without a wobble, their motion a smooth, terrifyingly beautiful circle of granite power. "Now the grain!" Cedric yelled over the rising roar. Alaric, his hands trembling, not from fear but from a surging, triumphant exhilaration, poured the first stream of golden wheat into the eye of the spinning stone. The mill inhaled it. There was a moment of grinding thunder, and then, from the gap between the stones, a stream of the finest, whitest, most beautiful flour he had ever seen. It was cooler, finer, and more consistent than any produced by the old mill. The new wheel's steady, powerful rotation was yielding a superior product. He caught a handful and let it sift through his fingers. It was cool and soft as swan's down. He looked at his father, and sallallahu alaihi wasallam, tears cutting clean paths through the dust on the old man's cheeks. They had done it. They had not just rebuilt, they had improved. They had taken the river's destructive fury and channeled it into a creation that was stronger, smarter, and more efficient than what had been lost. The first sack of flour from the new mill was presented to Lord William's steward. Malcolm took it, his face its usual mask of impartiality, but he could not hide the flicker of surprise in his eyes as he felt the quality of the meal. "The debt remains," he said, his voice clipped, "but the mill is acceptable." It was the highest praise they would ever receive from him. As Malcolm rode away, Alaric turned back to the roaring, living mill. The debt was a chain, yes, but the mill was his. His design, his vision, his will made manifest in wood and stone and iron. The first turn of the new wheel was not just a return to normalcy, it was the beginning of a new era. He was no longer Alaric the miller's son. He was Alaric the master, the creator, and his mill was the finest in the Shire. The reckoning of years. The new mill, which the villagers soon dubbed Alaric's wheel, did not just grind grain, it ground down their debt. The increased efficiency was undeniable. The finer flour commanded a better price at market, and the steadier power meant they could grind more grain in a day, increasing the tolls that went to the Lord. Season after season, year after year, the debt that had seemed an insurmountable mountain was slowly, inexorably reduced to a hill, then a mound, and finally a memory. The labor of repayment forged Alaric into a man of substance and quiet authority. The youthful leanness of his frame filled out with the solid muscle of constant, confident work. The uncertainty in his eyes was replaced by the calm, assessing gaze of a master craftsman who had faced ruin and transcended it. He was 25 years old, and the mill was unquestionably his. Cedric, now gray and stooped, happily ceded the daily operations to his son, content to sit in the sun and offer occasional sage advice, his own life's work secure in Alaric's capable hands. The year the final payment was made to the steward was the year Alaric and Lara were married. It was a celebration for the entire village, a symbolic closing of a dark chapter and the beginning of a bright one. They were wed in the small stone church, and the feast was held on the green, paid for by a collective contribution from the villagers, a tangible expression of their restored respect and affection. Even Boren, now a grudgingly respectful neighbor, brought a fat goose for the roasting pit. Alaric built a small but sturdy addition to the miller's cottage for himself and his new wife. Their life together became a new kind of harmony, a duet between the mill's roaring bass and the quiet, sustaining rhythm of domesticity. Ilara's herb garden flourished beside the mill race, its scents of mint, thyme, and rosemary a sweet counterpoint to the dusty perfume of grain. She learned to bake bread from their own flour, her loaves becoming renowned for their lightness and flavor. Their happiness was a deep, quiet pool, but it was not without its ripples of sorrow. Cedric, his life's purpose fulfilled and his strength spent, passed away peacefully in his sleep 2 winters after the wedding. He was buried in the churchyard within sight of the mill, his grave marked by a simple stone upon which Alaric had carved a small, neat water wheel. The mill felt his absence profoundly, a silence where a familiar, grounding presence had been. But Alaric felt his father's guidance in every turn of the wheel, in every decision he made. He was the mill's past and its future, now indivisible. It was in the 3rd year of his marriage, on a crisp autumn morning much like the one when he had first been brought to the mill as a child, that the next great challenge arrived. It came not with the fury of a storm, but with the quiet authority of a sealed parchment. A royal messenger, his tunic bearing the king's arms, rode into the mill yard. Alaric, his hands dusty with flour, stepped out to meet him, a knot of apprehension in his stomach. Royal attention was rarely a blessing for common men. "Alaric, miller of Oakham?" the messenger asked, his voice impersonal. "I am he." The messenger handed him the parchment. "By order of the Royal Commission of Trade, you are hereby summoned to present yourself and your mill for inspection. Your reputation for efficiency and the quality of your flour has come to the attention of the Crown. Your methods are of interest." The words were neutral, but their implication was staggering. The Crown was interested in him. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic rhythm of fear and a strange, burgeoning pride. He broke the wax seal and read the formal script. He was to demonstrate his mill's operation for a group of royal engineers and a representative of the exchequer. They were coming to study Alaric's wheel. The news sent a tremor through the village. The king's men! In Oakham? To see their mill? It was an event without precedent. For Alaric, it was a reckoning of a different kind. This was not an audit by a petty steward, but a judgment by the highest power in the land. His design, his life's work, would be scrutinized by masters of their craft. The day of the inspection arrived. 3 men on sleek palfreys, accompanied by a small retinue, rode into the mill yard. They were not like Malcolm. They were men of learning, their eyes sharp with intelligence, their hands clean, but their minds clearly accustomed to grappling with complex problems. The lead engineer, a man named Master Robert, dismounted and immediately began examining the external structure of the mill, the breastwork, the wheel itself, his fingers tracing the lines of the construction, his head nodding in quiet appreciation. Inside, Alaric was a model of focused efficiency. He explained the principles behind the curved breastwork and the steep-pitched paddles. He demonstrated the reinforced gearing, the improved balance of the stones. He did not boast. He simply presented the facts of his craft, his voice calm and sure. He poured the grain, and the mill roared to life, producing its flawless stream of flour. Master Robert watched it all, his expression unreadable. He asked pointed, insightful questions about load tolerances, maintenance schedules, the flow rate of the river. Alaric answered them all, his knowledge deep and practical. He even confessed to a minor flaw he had recently discovered in the gear ratio and his planned modification to correct it. Honesty, he felt, was the only policy with men such as these. The inspection lasted for hours. Finally, the men gathered their notes and prepared to leave. Master Robert turned to Alaric. "Your design is sound, Miller," he said, his tone one of professional respect. "More than sound, it is innovative. The efficiency gains you have achieved are significant. The Crown is building new mills in the Welsh marches to supply the garrison castles. Your design, with your permission, would be of great service." Alaric was stunned. The Crown wanted to use his design? His mind, his feel, translated into a blueprint for other mills across the kingdom. "There would be a royal patent," the exchequers man added, "a small annual stipend for the use of your innovation, and your name would be recorded in the rolls of the commission." A patent, a stipend, his name in a royal record? It was a validation beyond anything he had ever imagined. He was not just a miller serving his village, he was a craftsman contributing to the realm. He gave his permission, his voice thick with emotion. As the royal party rode away, Alaric stood alone in his mill, the familiar roar now a symphony of triumph. The reckoning was over. The boy who had felt the weight of a sack, the youth who had bargained with a steward, the man who had rebuilt from ruin, had now been measured by the highest authority in the land and found not wanting. He had paid his debts, he had earned his love, and now he had secured his legacy. Alaric the Miller had become a part of the history of England itself. The seams of the world. The royal patent, a finely inscribed piece of parchment now stored in a carved oak box, changed nothing and everything. The mill itself remained the same. The great wheel turned, the stones ground, the flour dust settled in a perpetual gentle snow. Alaric's daily life was unaltered. The same pre-dawn risings, the same greasing of bearings, the same listening for the mill's subtle shifts in health. Yet the knowledge that his design was being studied, that his name was known in chambers he could scarcely imagine, cast a different light upon his labors. He was no longer just a node in the local economy. He was a thread in the wider tapestry of the realm. This new perspective sharpened his senses to the larger forces that pulled at the seams of his world. The news brought by travelers and peddlers was no longer just distant gossip. It was a weather vane for the winds that could, in time, reach even the secluded banks of the Wending. Talk was of baronial unrest, of the new young King Henry II striving to rein in the powerful earls who had run rampant during the long, chaotic reign of Stephen. It was of taxes, of scutage paid in lieu of knight service, of the constant, grinding need for money to fund the crown's ambitions and secure its peace. Alaric felt these distant tremors in a direct personal way. The royal stipend was a welcome addition, but it was a tiny stream compared to the river of the king's needs. The tax assessors, different men from Malcolm, but with the same calculating eyes, began to visit with a new frequency. They assessed the mill's output, its profitability, its value as an asset with a new, invasive thoroughness. The hide of land the mill stood upon was re-evaluated. The debt to Lord William was gone, but a new, perpetual debt to the crown seemed to have taken its place. One evening, a traveling friar, a humble Franciscan seeking shelter from the rain, shared a meal with them. He was a gentleman with eyes that had seen much of the world's sorrow. "The wheel turns," the friar said, nodding towards the mill, "and so does the world. The king seeks to plant his law in every shire, to make his justice run like water in a mill race, predictable and powerful. But to build that race, he needs timber and stone and iron, and men to pay for it. Men like me," Alaric said, not with bitterness, but with a weary understanding. "The mill is a fixed point," the friar replied. "The village changes. Children are born. Elders die. Fields are fallow or fertile. But the mill is always here, always grinding. It is therefore a fixed point for the tax collector's quill. You, Master Miller, have become a pillar of the king's peace, whether you wish it or not. Your flour feeds the men who build his castles and the scribes who record his laws." The truth of this settled deep within Alaric. His success, his innovation, had woven him more tightly into the fabric of a power structure that was both abstract and crushingly immediate. He was a free man, not a serf, but his freedom was a defined space, its borders patrolled by royal officials and manorial lords. This tightening of the world's seams brought a new wave of transients to the mill. Not all were gentle friars. Men displaced by the king's campaigns in Wales, their homes burned, their livestock taken, passed through Oakham, their eyes hollow with a loss that mirrored the ruin Alaric had once felt. Runaway serfs, fleeing harsh lords for the precarious freedom of the towns, sometimes sought a night's work hauling sacks for a meal. Each face was a story of a world in flux, a reminder that the order of things was not as solid as the millstones. One such man was a Welshman named Rodri, a charcoal burner by trade, his clothes singed and his hands blackened beyond cleaning. He had fled the fighting in the marches, his simple livelihood destroyed in the clash between two lords who did not know his name. Alaric gave him food and let him sleep in the warm, dusty loft of the mill. In the morning, Rodri stood with Alaric, watching the wheel turn. "A fine machine," he said in his heavily accented English. "Where I am from, the grindstones are turned by hand, a woman's work. It takes all day to make flour for one loaf. This," he gestured at the roaring machinery, "this is like magic. It makes time itself." "It binds me to this spot as surely as a chain," Alaric replied. Rodri considered this. "A chain of your own making is still a chain, but it is a better chain than one put on you by another man." He pointed to the iron bands on the wheel. "You see, you put the metal on the wood to make it stronger. The king, he puts his law on the land to make his kingdom stronger. It is the same. It is a harness. The question is, who holds the reins?" The man's simple wisdom struck Alaric. He was not merely a subject. He was a part of the machinery of the state, a small but vital gear. His innovation had made his gear spin more efficiently, which in turn made the whole machine, the kingdom, run more smoothly. His personal ambition had dovetailed, quite by accident, with the crown's need for order and revenue. When Rodri moved on, heading east towards the promise of London, Alaric watched him go, a solitary figure on the road that led to an ever more connected world. He felt the reins in his own hands, the reins of the mill, of his life, of his small place in the great design. They were heavy, but they were his. The world was drawing its seams tighter, enclosing him in a system of taxes and laws and royal interest. But within that enclosure, he had built a domain of competence and respect. The mill was his fixed point, his answer to the chaos beyond the horizon. He would grind his flour, pay his dues, and tend to his own. In a world being stitched together by kings and lawyers, the relentless, honest turn of the water wheel was its own kind of sovereignty. The heir's hand. The turning of the years was marked not only by the seasons of grain, but by the rhythm of life within the miller's cottage. The profound joy that had filled the space after Alaric and Alara's marriage deepened and multiplied with the birth of their son. They named him Cedric for his grandfather, but the boy, from the moment he could focus his wide, curious eyes, was captivated by the mill. His first unsteady steps were taken on the flour-dusted floor. His first word, after Mama and Dada, was a garbled attempt at wheel. For Alaric, the presence of his son transformed the mill from a legacy he had earned into one he would bestow. The weight of the future, which had once been an abstract pressure, now had a face, a laugh, a small, warm hand that sought his own. He saw the mill anew through the boy's eyes, not as a place of toil and responsibility, but as a world of immense, fascinating wonder. He began the boy's education as his father had begun his, not with force, but with gentle immersion. He would sit little Cedric on a stack of sacks and talk to him as he worked, explaining the purpose of the toll dish, the sound of a healthy bearing, the feel of good grain. "Listen," Alaric would say, lifting the boy to listen to the great spur wheel as it turned. "Hear that? A steady hum. That is the sound of everything being right." The child would nod, his small face serious with imitation of his father's concentration. Ilara would watch them from the doorway, a smile on her lips and a watchful concern in her heart. She knew the mill's allure, its deep rhythmic pull on the men of this family. She also knew its dangers. When Cedric was 5, the same age Alaric had been when first brought to the mill, a moment of terrifying clarity seared itself into their lives. The boy, nimble and inquisitive, had learned to climb the ladder to the loft where the grain was stored. Alaric was below, dressing the millstones with the bill, his back turned. Ilara was in the cottage garden. A sudden, sharp scraping sound, entirely foreign to the mill's normal song, made Alaric's heart freeze. It was followed by a small, startled cry. He spun around. Cedric, seeking a better view, had leaned too far over the low loft railing. A sack of rye, poorly stacked, had shifted and tumbled, its weight knocking the boy off balance. He was falling, a small flailing shape plummeting towards the hard stone floor and the unforgiving machinery below. Time did not slow, it shattered. Alaric moved without thought, his body a projectile launched by pure instinct. He did not calculate the distance or the risk. He threw himself forward, not to catch the boy, but to place his own body between his son and the grinding stones. He hit the floor hard, his shoulder taking the impact, and slid, his arms outstretched. Cedric landed on his chest with a soft, sickening thud. The wind knocked from them both. The fallen sack of grain burst open beside them, spraying rye like a golden explosion. The mill, oblivious, continued its thunderous rotation. The great stones ground on, mere feet from where they lay. Alaric clutched his son, his entire body trembling with a delayed, volcanic terror. The boy was crying, more from shock than injury, his small fists gripping Alaric's tunic. Ilara was there in an instant, her face white as unbaked dough. She gathered Cedric into her arms, checking him over with frantic, practiced hands. He was bruised and frightened, but whole. It was Alaric who was truly shaken. He sat on the floor amidst the scattered rye, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked at the spinning stones, at the relentless, impersonal power of the machinery he loved. He had always known its dangers intellectually, but now he felt them in his soul, a cold, metallic fear that eclipsed any he had felt for himself. That night, after a subdued Cedric was put to bed, Ilara found Alaric standing in the dark mill, staring at the silent stones. "I will not force this life upon him," Alaric said, his voice hollow. "I will not have his blood on these stones." Ilara came to stand beside him, her presence a calm anchor in his storm of dread. "You cannot wrap him in swaddling his whole life, Alaric. The mill is in his blood, as it is in yours. You cannot carve it out of him." "But the danger." "The world is danger," she interrupted gently. "The field has its plagues, the forest its wolves, the road its thieves. You taught him to respect the river. Now you must teach him to master the mill, not by keeping him away, but by showing him its every tooth and claw. Your father gave you that gift. It is your turn to give it to your son." Her words were a balm and a challenge. The next morning, Alaric did not ban Cedric from the mill. Instead, he took the boy to the very spot where he had fallen. He showed him how the sack had been stacked incorrectly. He explained the precise crushing weight of a full quarter sack. He let him touch the cool, hard granite of the millstones and explained, in simple terms, what would happen to a bone caught between them. He began a new, more deliberate education. He taught Cedric how to break the wheel safely, how to test the temperature of the stones, how to listen for the specific groan of a strained bearing. The lessons were not just about operation, but about vigilance, about reading the language of risk. The boy learned. The fear from his fall was not erased, but it was transformed into a deep, solemn respect. He became more careful, more observant. He was his father's shadow, his small brow furrowed in concentration, his ears learning to filter the mill's song for any note of discord. Alaric watched him, the fear in his own heart slowly being replaced by a burgeoning pride. He saw his own childhood curiosity reflected in his son's eyes, but now tempered by a caution that had been hard-won. The heir's hand was small and clumsy now, but it was learning the shape of his inheritance. It would learn to be strong, to be skilled, to be wise. The mill had almost taken a son. Now it would be the forge that shaped one. The line would continue. The wheel would turn for another generation. The tithing of scars. The near disaster with young Cedric left an invisible scar upon Alaric, a permanent layer of caution that settled over his mastery like a fine, persistent dust. He watched his son's every movement within the mill with a hawk's intensity. His feel now extended to encompass the boy's safety. Yet, as Elara had foreseen, the mill's call was too potent to be silenced by fear. The boy's fascination only grew, becoming more thoughtful, more deliberate. He was learning the mill's language not just as a user, but as a future guardian. This new, watchful phase of Alaric's life was interrupted by a summons of a different, more communal nature. The village of Oakham, like all communities under the king's law, was organized into a tithing, a group of 10 households collectively responsible for each other's good behavior. Us a man of substance and now unassailable reputation, Alaric was expected to take his turn serving us the tithing man, a role akin to a constable for their small corner of the world. It was a duty he had never sought. His kingdom was the mill. Its laws were of water and stone. The messy, emotional laws of men felt like a foreign country. But refusal was not an option. The role fell to him, and with a heavy sigh, he accepted the symbolic staff of office, a stout piece of blackthorn wood. His first test came swiftly. A chicken was stolen from Widow Agnes's coop, the same Agnes whose life Elara and Alaric had saved years before. The loss of a single chicken was not a grand crime, but to the widow it was a significant portion of her meager livelihood. The accusation, whispered and pointed, landed on a surly, rootless laborer who had recently been hired to help with the harvest. The village expected a swift, simple judgment. The man was an outsider. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. A quick finding of guilt, a restitution ordered, and the matter would be closed. But Alaric, whose entire life was built on listening for the truth beneath the obvious noise, felt a discordance. He went to the widow's coop not to confirm the theft, but to understand it. He examined the broken latch, the scattered feathers. He saw the precise, almost delicate way the wood had been splintered. Then he visited the accused laborer, a man named Cole, who lived in a leaky shelter on the edge of the common land. Cole denied the theft with a sullen, desperate defiance. But it was not Cole's words that Alaric listened to. It was his surroundings. He saw the man's tools, a rusty billhook, a broken-handled spade. And he saw the man's hands, large, clumsy, and bearing fresh, deep scratches from bramble and rough work. The broken latch at the widow's coop showed a clean, sharp break, the work of a tool used with finesse, not the brutish strength of a man like Cole. The true culprit was revealed not by accusation, but by observation.
Alaric, walking the village track, saw a single, bright feather caught in the thorny hedge outside the cottage of a man named Leofric, a known idler and poacher. Leofric, when confronted, not with shouts, but with Alaric's quiet, unwavering gaze and the single damning feather, broke down and confessed. He had used a small, sharp chisel to pop the latch, a tool far more suited to his sly nature. Alaric's judgment was swift. Leofric was to repay widow Agnes 2 chickens from his own flock, and perform a week's labor for her, mending her fence and digging her garden. The resolution was met with general approval, but it was the process that earned Alaric a new kind of respect. He had not bowed to the easy verdict. He had sifted the evidence like he sifted flour, separating the truth from the chaff of suspicion. His next case was more painful. It involved Borin's eldest son, a hot-headed youth named Cerdic, who had gotten into a drunken brawl with another young man, breaking his nose and 2 of his ribs. The injured boy's family demanded harsh punishment, a flogging, or a heavy fine that would cripple Borin's household. Alaric listened to both families, their faces contorted with anger and fear. He saw the shame in Borin's eyes, the memory of his own past grievances now reflected in his son's foolishness. This was not a case of theft, but of wounded pride and alehouse temper. He gave his judgment in the mill yard, the entire tithing gathered around. Cerdic was to work for the injured boy's family for a full month, doing the labor the injured boy could not. Furthermore, he was to forfeit his own wages from the harvest to the family as compensation. But there would be no flogging, no crippling fine. A broken bone mends, Alaric told the sullen Cerdic and the gathered villagers, his voice carrying the quiet authority of the mill's hum. But a spirit broken by hatred, or a family broken by debt, may never heal. You will learn the weight of your anger by carrying the burden of your victim's work. That is a heavier lesson than the lash. Borin, who had expected the worst, looked at Alaric with an expression of profound, wordless gratitude. The judgment was hard, but it was fair. It sought to mend the community, not just to punish the offender. Through these duties, Alaric came to understand his father's old saying about walking a narrow path. As tithingman, he was the hinge between the people and the Lord's justice.
He, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the secret struggles of his neighbors, the hidden hunger, the private debts, the simmering jealousies.
He learned that justice was not a sharp blade, but a balancing scale, and that the true task was not to punish, but to restore balance. When his year of service ended, he handed the blackthorn staff to the next man with a sense of relief, but also with a new depth of understanding. The mill was his heart, but the village was its body. He could not tend to one without regard for the other. The tithing of his time had left him with scars of knowledge, a map of the human frailties and strengths that surrounded his dusty, noisy kingdom. He had grist for his own mill, and he had grist for the soul of Oakham, and he had learned to grind both with a measure of compassion. The scribe's ink. A new kind of traveler began to seek out the mill at Oakham, drawn not by the need for flour or shelter, but by the lure of its story. The fame of Alaric's wheel, amplified by the royal patent, had seeped into the world of clerks and chroniclers. To these men of letters, the mill was not just a machine, it was a symbol of the age, a testament to English ingenuity, to the application of reason to the ancient problems of subsistence. The first to arrive was a monk from a distant abbey, a chronicler compiling a history of the technological advancements of his time. He was a frail man with ink-stained fingers and a mind like a ratchet, clicking forward with precise, inquisitive questions. He sat for days on a stool in the corner of the milling room, his wax tablet on his knee, observing, questioning, recording. He asked Alaric to explain the principles of the curved breastwork, the mathematics of the gear ratios, the metallurgy of the reinforced axle. Alaric, who knew these things in his hands and his ears, struggled to translate them into the language of geometry and philosophy. It was a strange reverse alchemy, turning the gold of lived experience back into the lead of abstract theory. "You see," Alaric said, trying to explain his feel, "the mill tells you when it is unhappy. It is a tightness in the sound, a vibration that is wrong." The monk scribbled furiously. "Fascinating! A sensate knowledge, an intuitive harmonic diagnosis. We must call it sensus mullendinarius, the mill sense." Alaric almost smiled. He had spent a lifetime developing this skill, and now it was to be given a Latin name and filed away in an abbey library. It felt both validating and strangely diminishing, like having a part of his soul catalogued. The monk was followed by a royal clerk, a sharp-faced man from the exchequer who was less interested in the mechanics than in the economics. He wanted numbers, the increase in output, the reduction in grinding time, the value of the improved flour at market. He measured the flow of the river, calculated the theoretical maximum power of the wheel, and compared the toll records before and after the rebuild. "You have increased the Lord's revenue from this manor by a notable percentage," the clerk stated, his voice crisp and final. "Your design, Miller, is a quantifiable asset to the Crown's peace. It promotes prosperity. A prosperous man is a peaceful man. A peaceful manor pays its taxes." Alaric nodded, understanding that, in the eyes of this man, he was not a craftsman, but a statistic, a positive integer in the great ledger of the realm. His innovation was valuable because it made the collection of silver pennies more efficient. These visits left him feeling curiously hollow. His life's work was being dissected, labeled, and valued by systems of thought entirely foreign to him. The mill, which was to him a living, breathing entity, was becoming a diagram, a column of numbers, a footnote in someone else's story. The final visitor was the most unexpected. He was a young man, little older than Alaric had been when he rebuilt the mill, but with the soft hands and fervent eyes of a scholar from the nascent university at Oxford. He introduced himself as Edmund,
And he carried not official parchments, but a sheaf of cheap paper and a burning curiosity. "Master Miller," Edmund began, his speech tumbling out in an eager rush, "I am not here for the crown or the church. I am here for the idea that a man, through his own reason and observation, can improve upon the world God gave him. They are teaching Aristotle again in Paris, you know. They speak of the four causes: the material, the formal, the efficient, the final. Your mill, it is a perfect illustration." Alaric, weary of being studied, almost turned him away, but the young man's passion was disarming. He was not looking at Alaric as a subject, but as a teacher. "Tell me," Edmund pleaded, "what was the first thought, the moment you knew the old way was not enough?" And so, for the first time, Alaric told the whole story, not just the technical details, but the human ones. The fear of the levee, the crushing weight of the debt, the sound of the splintering wheel, the long nights of despair, the spark of the new design born from utter ruin. He spoke of Ilara's faith, of Orvin's skepticism, of Ivor's strength. He spoke of the feel. Edmund listened, rapt, his pen scratching across the paper, capturing not just the facts, but the narrative. He was not writing a report. He was composing a biography of an idea. "When you changed the pitch of the paddles," Edmund asked, his eyes alight, "you were seeking a more efficient cause, were you not? You were optimizing the transfer of energy from the water to the wheel. Your final cause was not just to grind grain, but to secure your freedom, to rebuild your future." Alaric looked at the young man, this scribe of ideas, and finally felt a glimmer of understanding. The monk had wanted to classify him. The clerk had wanted to tax him. But this boy wanted to understand him. He was using his ink not to record a thing, but to capture a spirit. When Edmund left, his papers filled with the story of the mill's rebirth, he clasped Alaric's hand. "Thank you, Master Miller. You have shown me that philosophy does not live only in books. It lives in the hands of men who work. You have taken the abstract and made it real. That is the highest form of knowledge." Alaric stood alone in the mill after the young scholar had gone. The roar of the machinery seemed different. It was no longer just the sound of work, or of debt being repaid, or even of a legacy being built. It was the sound of an idea, his idea, made manifest in the world. It was an idea that had been weighed by the steward, patented by the king, chronicled by the monk, and valued by the clerk. But it was the scribe's ink, the telling of its story, that finally made it feel complete. His struggle, his grief, his triumph would not be lost. They would become a story, a lesson, a spark for another young mind in another time. The mill would grind flour for the body, but its story, now, would feed the mind. And in that, Alaric found a satisfaction deeper than any royal patent or silver penny. The weight of the crown. The fame that came with the royal patent and the scholar's visits was a double-edged sword, comparable to the mill's own axle. It provided power, but it also bore a tremendous, unrelenting strain. Alaric found his role evolving once more, from master miller to a local arbiter of the crown's ever-expanding will. He was no longer merely a tenant of Lord William. He had become, in the eyes of the royal administration, a reliable node of authority, a man whose competence and loyalty could be leveraged. This new weight manifested in a summons to the county assizes. It was not us a defendant, nor us a juror from the tithing, but us a expert witness. The case involved a dispute between a powerful local baron and a neighboring abbey over water rights for their respective mills. The conflict had festered for years, escalating from muttered grievances to armed men threatening to dismantle each other's mill races. The king's justice, in the form of a traveling royal judge, was determined to settle it. Alaric stood before the court in the great hall of the shire town, feeling acutely out of place. The air was thick with the scent of wool, sweat, and the faint metallic tang of power. The baron glowered from one side, his chainmail-clad retainers a silent promise of violence. The abbot sat in serene defiance on the other, his black robes a stark contrast, his own power derived from God and vast landholdings. The judge, a man with a weary, intelligent face and a voice that cut through the hall's murmur, called Alaric forward. "Master Miller of Oakham, you are known to this court as a man of skill and repute. Your own design for a water wheel is a matter of record. You will examine the depositions and the maps. You will tell us which lord, spiritual or temporal, has the prior and superior claim to the flow of this river for the purpose of milling." It was an impossible question. Ancient charters, some forged, some lost, were cited by both sides. Custom and memory conflicted. Alaric knew his answer would please no one, and could earn him a powerful enemy, perhaps even two. He spent a day studying the crude maps and listening to the arguments. He ignored the bluster of the baron's steward and the intricate Latin legalisms of the abbot's clerk. Instead, he asked to be taken to the river itself. He stood between the two mills, one old and inefficient, the other poorly maintained. He watched the water flow. He saw where the baron's new dam had raised the water level, flooding the abbey's water meadows. He saw where the abbey's wider mill race was silting up, slowing the baron's wheel downstream. His testimony the next day was not about charters or ancient rites. It was about the river. He spoke its language. "The river is not a possession," he told the silent, rapt court. "It is a journey. A mill is a traveler upon that journey, taking sustenance from its flow. But no traveler can dam the road for himself without starving those who come after." He pointed to the maps. "My lords, the problem is not law, but physics. The baron's dam raises the water level here, costing the abbey good grazing land. The abbey's silted race slows the current here, robbing the baron's wheel of power. You are both choking the same river. The solution is not to decide who owns the water, but to manage its flow for the benefit of both." He then proposed a practical, detailed solution. The baron's dam should be lowered by a specified height, and the abbey must commit to a regular schedule of dredging its race. He even sketched a design for a sluice gate that could be operated jointly to manage flow during drought and flood. The judge listened, his chin resting on his hand. The baron and the abbot stared at Alaric, their anger momentarily displaced by sheer astonishment. This common miller was not taking a side, he was redesigning the landscape of their conflict. The judge's ruling adopted Alaric's solution almost in its entirety. It was a Solomon-like judgment that recognized the wisdom of the miller over the pride of the magnates. Alaric left the assizes with no payment, but with something far more dangerous, the reputation of being the man who had dictated terms to a baron and an abbot. Upon his return to Oakham, the weight of the crown felt heavier than ever. Lord William, his own liege lord, summoned him. The lord was not angry, but watchful, his gaze that of a man reassessing an asset that had unexpectedly appreciated in value. "You have the ear of the king's justice now, Miller," Lord William said, his tone deceptively casual. "That is a curious position for a man who grinds my grain. Use that ear wisely. Remember where your bread is buttered." The message was clear. His usefulness to the crown elevated him, But it also made him a potential threat to the traditional hierarchy. He was walking a razor's edge between the old power of the manor and the new centralizing power of the throne. From then on, royal officials consulting on other local projects, a new bridge, a drainage canal, would invariably stop at Oakham to seek the miller's opinion. His world, once bounded by the sound of his own wheel, now encompassed the entire hydrology of the Shire. He was becoming a servant of the realm's infrastructure, his mind a resource for the king's peace. He felt the burden in his bones, a constant, low hum of responsibility that was separate from the mill's own song. The crown's weight was not a sudden blow like a falling tree, but a steady, insistent pressure, like the water itself, wearing away at his independence, reshaping him for its own purposes. He had sought only to secure his mill and his freedom. In achieving that, he had bound himself to a master far more distant and demanding than any steward. The wheel turned, the flour flowed, but the man who stood at its center was now accountable to a kingdom. The harvest of a lifetime. The relentless turning of the great wheel carved the years from Alaric's life as surely as it ground the grain. The dark hair at his temples surrendered to silver, and the lines on his face, once etched by sudden strains and fears, deepened into the steady, weathered grooves of a long-held mastery. The frantic energy of his youth and the desperate drive of his middle years mellowed into a profound, seasoned calm. He had become the elder of Oakham, a figure whose wisdom was sought not only on milling and water, but on life itself. His son, Cedric, was now a man grown, his shoulders broad, his hands strong and capable. The boy's childhood fascination had matured into a deep, intuitive understanding of the mill that mirrored his father's own. Alaric watched him work with a pride that was quiet and absolute. Cedric had the feel. He could diagnose a faltering bearing by a shift in the vibration of the floorboards, could adjust the tentering screw for a perfect grind by the sound of the stones alone. The mill was safe. The legacy was secure. One afternoon in late summer, with the harvest moon a pale ghost in the blue sky, Alaric did something he had not done in years. He handed the great iron lever that engaged the machinery to his son. "It is your mill today, Cedric," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I will watch." He settled himself on an upturned barrel near the door, a place where he could feel the sun on his face and watch his son move through the familiar, beautiful ballet of the mill's operation. He saw, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, Cedric's confident stride, the economy of his motions, the way he listened to the mill's song with his whole body. It was like watching his own youth reflected in a clear, untroubled pool. He let his gaze wander around the space that had been his entire world. He saw Lala not just the machinery, but the ghosts of moments past. Over there, by the grain hopper, was where his father had first let him pour the wheat. In that corner, he had cowered from Malcolm's accusing glare. Against that wall, he had held Elara for the first time, the scent of her hair a miracle in the dusty air. On that very spot, his son had fallen from the loft, a moment of terror that had taught them both the price of their inheritance. The thunder of the stones, which had once been a noise he had to decipher, was now a complex symphony whose every note he understood. It was the music of his life. The relentless rhythm was the beating of his own heart. The flour dust that settled on everything was the very substance of his days. Cedric finished the grind and expertly braked the wheel, bringing the roaring giant to a gentle, sighing halt. The sudden silence was, as always, profound. "It runs well," Cedric said, wiping his brow with his sleeve, leaving a floury streak. "The new bearing on the pit wheel is settling in. The hum is cleaner." Alaric nodded. "I heard it. You dressed the stones last week. The fineness of the flower is perfect. You have a better touch with the mill bill than I ever did." The praise, rare and specific, made Cedric stand a little taller. He came and sat on a sack near his father. For a long moment they sat in a comfortable silence, two masters in a shared kingdom. "Do you ever wish you had done something else?" Cedric asked, his voice thoughtful. "Seen the world? Fought in a war? Been a merchant?" Alaric looked out the door, at the familiar curve of the river, the steadfast bulk of the great oak, the smoke rising from the cottages of the village he had served his whole life. "I have seen the world," Alaric replied, his gaze distant. "I have seen it in the 1,000 different shades of gold in a field of wheat. I have fought in a war, a lifelong campaign against entropy and decay, against flood and frost and the simple, wearing passage of time. And I have been a merchant. I have traded my strength, my mind, my years for the sight of a village that does not go hungry."
What king or merchant prince has a better ledger than that? He looked at his son, his eyes clear and certain. "This mill is not a prison, Cedric. It is a lens. It focuses a whole life into a single, purposeful point. The world out there," he gestured vaguely towards the road, "it is vast and loud and confusing. But in here, the equation is simple. The river flows, the wheel turns, the grain becomes bread. It is a truth you can build a life upon." He stood up, his joints complaining with a familiar ache. He laid a hand on the cool granite of the millstone, a final, affectionate touch. "This is the harvest of my lifetime, son, not the flour in the sacks or the silver in the box. It is this moment, seeing you here, capable and sure, knowing that when I am gone, the song will not stop. The wheel will turn for you and for your children after you. That is the only immortality a man like me can ever hope for." He walked out into the evening light, leaving Cedric alone in the silent mill. The younger man looked around, seeing it now through his father's eyes, not as a collection of wood and stone, but as a living chronicle, a story written in grain and water and grit. He understood then that his inheritance was not just a building or a trade, it was a narrative, a purpose, a soul. And he felt the weight of it, not as a burden, but as a mantle, woven from the threads of all the days that had come before. The harvest was in, the granary was full, and the cycle was ready to begin again. The last grain. The winter of Alaric's 72nd year was a gentle one, a slow drawing in of the light. The fierce energies that had once animated him, the frantic labor of rebuilding, the sharp focus of innovation, the vigilant tension of leadership, had ebbed, leaving behind a deep, still pool of contentment. He spent his days mostly by the hearth in the cottage or sitting on a bench outside the mill, a thick woolen blanket across his knees, watching the wheel turn under his son's masterful hand. The mill's song was a lullaby to him now, a familiar rhythm that soothed rather than stirred. He no longer heard the individual components, the complaint of a gear, the rush of water, the grind of stone. He heard the whole, a single resonant note of harmonious purpose. It was the sound of a world in balance, the sound of his life's work complete. He knew his body was failing him. The cold, which he had once battled with fire and pole, now settled deep into his bones, a chill no flame could entirely chase away. The strength that had lifted quarter sacks with a grunt was gone, his hands now gnarled and restful on the arms of his chair. He was like the final smooth stone in a riverbed, all his sharp edges worn away by the relentless, beautiful flow of time.
Ilara, her own hair a cloud of white, but her eyes still holding their clear green light, was his constant attendant. She would read to him from the Psalter, or simply sit with him, her knitting needles clicking a soft counterpoint to the distant rumble of the mill. Their conversations were less of words and more of shared silence, a language forged over 5 decades of shared joy and sorrow. A touch of her hand, a meeting of their eyes, it was all that was needed to convey a universe of understanding. One crisp, bright morning, he felt a strange clarity, a lifting of the fog that had begun to cloud his thoughts. He asked Ilara to help him to the mill. "Are you sure, my love?" she asked, her voice soft with concern. "The cold." "The mill is warm," he replied with a faint smile. "It has its own heart. I would feel it beat one more time." Leaning heavily on her and with a stout walking stick, he made the slow, familiar journey from the cottage to the mill door. Cedric, seeing them approach, hurried over, his face etched with worry. "Father, you should be inside." "I am where I need to be," Alaric said, his voice thin but firm. "Let me sit. Let me listen." Cedric and Ilara helped him to his accustomed barrel near the door, bundling the blanket tightly around him. The mill was in full operation, the air vibrant with thunder and dust. Alaric closed his eyes. He did not need to see. He could feel it all. He felt the deep, powerful thrum of the new wheel, the one he had designed, the one that had borne his name to the king's own clerks. He felt the precise, humming vibration of the perfectly balanced stones, dressed to a sharp edge by his son's skilled hand. He smelled the rich, sweet scent of the flower, a scent that was the perfume of life itself, the smell of sustenance and community. In the roaring darkness behind his eyelids, the memories came not as ghosts, but as living presences. He was 5 years old again, his small hand in his father's, feeling the terrifying, wonderful power for the first time. He was a young man, his muscles burning, the weight of a community on his back. He was a lover, stealing a kiss in the moonlit silence. He was a fighter, staring down the ruin of a flood, a spark of defiance igniting in his soul. He was a creator, watching his design take form in wood and iron. He was a father, his heart stopping as his son fell, then swelling with a pride that knew no bounds. He had known fear, despair, exhaustion, and the bitter taste of injustice. But they were merely the husk. What remained, what was ground fine and true by the millstone of his years, was the pure, nourishing kernel of a life lived with purpose. He had been the hinge. He had turned the gift of the river into the bread of life. There was no simpler, no greater truth. He opened his eyes and looked at Cedric, who was watching him, his expression a mixture of love and acute sorrow. Alaric gave a slow, deliberate nod, a gesture of final transfer. It said, "It is yours. It is well. I am at peace." He then turned his gaze to Ilara. He did not speak. He simply looked at her, pouring into that one look a lifetime of gratitude, of shared battles, of quiet nights, of a love that had been the steady, unwavering current beneath the turbulent surface of his days. She took his hand, her fingers still strong, closing around his frail ones. She understood. She had always understood. A great tiredness washed over him then, not the weary fatigue of a day's labor, but a profound, welcoming exhaustion.
It was the feeling of a long journey completed, a heavy weight finally, gracefully laid down. He took one last deep breath, filling his lungs with the air of his mill, the air of flour and grain, of oiled wood and damp stone. It was the breath of his life. His head dipped slowly onto his chest. The roaring of the mill, which had been the soundtrack of his existence, seemed to soften, to recede, becoming a distant, gentle hum, like the memory of a song. The last grain of sand in the hourglass of his life slipped silently into the bottom. The great wheel of the mill continued its turn, unceasing, indifferent, and beautiful. The work of the world went on. But for Alaric, the miller of Oakham, the grinding had stopped. His song was complete, its final resonant note hanging forever in the flour-dusted air of the kingdom he had built with his own 2 hands. The unending flow. The silence that followed Alaric's passing was a different quality of quiet than the mill had ever known. It was a respectful, grieving silence, thick with memory. For 3 days the great wheel was braked, the millstones still. The river, cheated of its labor, chattered past the silent paddles, its voice the only sound in the hollowed-out building. It was a mark of respect for the master, a recognition that the heart that had given the mill its purpose was gone. The village of Oakham felt his absence like a change in the weather. The familiar, reassuring thunder from the riverbank was a constant in their lives, a guarantee of order and continuity. Its cessation was deeply disquieting, a reminder of their own mortality and the fragility of the systems that sustained them. They came not to grind grain, but to pay their respects, standing in quiet groups outside the mill, their heads bowed. Ilara, wrapped in a cloak of dignified sorrow, was the rock upon which the household steadied herself. She had known this day would come. She had prepared for it in the practical way she prepared for winter, storing up strength and resolve. She directed the washing and laying out of his body. She received the condolences of the villagers, her composure a quiet strength that held their shared grief at bay. The funeral was held in the small churchyard, within sight of the mill. The entire village was there, from the Lord William himself, who offered a stiff, formal word of condolence to Cedric, to the poorest cotter, whose children Alaric had often fed with a handful of extra flour. Boren, now an old man himself, stood at the back, his head uncovered, his face a landscape of hard-lived years and genuine respect. The friar who had once spoken of the world's turning came to say the Mass. They buried Alaric next to his father, the 2 millers side by side, their graves looking towards the water that had given them their lives and their meaning. The stone carved with the water wheel now had a companion, a matching stone upon which Cedric had inscribed simply, "Alaric, Master Miller." The river sang his song. After the last mourner had departed, Cedric stood alone in the silent mill. The emptiness was a physical weight. He was the master now, in truth. The knowledge was terrifying. For all his skill, the mill had always been his father's presence, his father's soul. Now it was just wood and stone and iron and the crushing weight of expectation. He did not know how to start it again. To engage the machinery felt like an act of erasure, a declaration that life could simply continue without the man who had been its center. It was Ilara who found him there, standing motionless in the twilight.
She did not touch him. She simply stood beside him, looking at the dormant giant. "He would not want this silence," she said, her voice clear and steady in the vast quiet. "The mill has a duty. The village has a need. Your father understood that better than anyone. This," she gestured at the still machinery, "this would feel like a betrayal to him." "I don't know if I can do it without him," Cedric whispered, the confession torn from him. "You can," she said, turning to face him, "because he is not truly gone. He is in the balance of these stones. He is in the curve of that breastwork. He is in the knowledge in your hands and the feel in your soul. You are not starting it without him. You are starting it for him. You are continuing his song. That is the greatest honor you can give him." Her words were a key, turning a lock in his heart. He looked at the mill, and for the first time, he did not see an absence. He saw a presence. He saw his father's life etched into every beam, every gear, every furrow in the granite. He nodded, a new resolve hardening within him. He walked to the sluice gate. The mechanism was heavy, but his hands, so like his father's, found a familiar purchase. He strained, and the gate began to rise. The water, patient and powerful, surged into the race. It struck the paddles of Alaric's wheel. There was a moment of resistance, and then the deep, groaning protest as the giant awoke. The wheel began to turn. The gears engaged with a series of solid, satisfying clunks. The vertical shaft spun, and the millstones, the great heart of the mill, began their relentless, grinding rotation. The roar filled the building, shaking the dust from the beams. It was the same sound, and yet it was entirely new. It was his sound now. Cedric stood in the center of the thunder, letting it wash over him. He felt the vibration in the floorboards, a sensation his father had known for 70 years. He looked at Alara, who watched him from the doorway, a small, proud smile on her face. He saw his own son, a boy of 10, peering in with wide, awe-struck eyes, just as he himself had once done. The unending flow of the river had been harnessed once more. The work of the world went on. The mill was alive. Alaric was gone, but he was everywhere. In the turning wheel, in the flowing flower, in the strong, capable hands of his son. The song had not ended. It had simply found a new voice. The legend in the stone. Generations turned like the millstones themselves, each one grinding the coarse grain of the present into the fine flour of memory, of story, of legend. The world Alaric had known shifted and changed in ways he could never have imagined. The Lord Williams of Oakham came and went, their direct power waning, as kings centralized their rule, and the slow, grinding wheels of commerce and law turned ever faster. The feudal obligations that had once defined life softened, replaced by rents and wages. But through it all, the mill on the Wending endured. It was no longer just the mill. It was Alaric's mill. The name, once spoken with pride by the man himself, became a title, a brand of quality and reliability known throughout the widening shire. The flour that bore its imprint was sought after for its consistent fineness, a secret whispered to lie in the unique curve of the breastwork and the perfect balance of the stones. Secrets passed down from father to son in the Miller family, a dynasty now rooted as deeply as the mill's own foundations.
Cedric ruled the mill with his father's quiet competence for 30 years. He raised his own children within the sound of the wheel. His son, whom he named Alaric, learning the craft at his knee just as he had at his own father's. The legacy was not a burden to them, but a birthright, a proud and noble calling. They maintained the machinery with reverent care, replacing timbers and sharpening stones. But the core of Alaric's design, the heart of the mill, remained untouched, a sacred trust. The village of Oakham grew, its cottages spreading slowly up the gentle slope from the river. New families arrived, their ancestors forgotten, but they too learned the story. They were told of the great flood, of the miller who had defied a steward and rebuilt his world from splinters and determination. They were told of the royal patent, of the man whose wisdom had been sought by barons and kings. The historical figure of Alaric, the man of flesh and blood and flower dust, began to recede, his sharp edges smoothed by time. In his place grew Alaric the legend. He became a figure of folklore. It was said he could hear a cracked gear before it broke, that he could smell blight in the grain before it was milled. Mothers would tell their children that the steady rumble of the mill was the sound of Alaric's ghost, still tending his life's work, ensuring the bread rose in their ovens. On Midsummer's Eve, young lovers would walk to the mill pond, believing that a wish made there, with the wheel turning in the background, would be blessed by the spirit of the miller whose own love had been so strong and true. The physical mill became a pilgrimage site of sorts, not for saints, but for craftsmen. Apprentice carpenters and stonemasons would be brought by their masters to study the joinery of the great wheel, to see the elegant sweep of the breastwork. "Look," the masters would say, tapping the ancient iron-shod timber. "This is the work of Alaric of Oakham. See how it respects the water? See how it endures? This is what true craft looks like. It serves a purpose, and it outlives the man." Centuries after his death, when the age of water wheels was itself being challenged by steam and iron, a new lord of the manor, a man with an interest in antiquities and industrial history, took it upon himself to preserve the mill. It was no longer the primary source of flour for the district, but it was a working museum, a testament to a vanishing way of life. He had a plaque mounted beside the door, engraved with a brief history. It mentioned Lord William and Steward Malcolm, but its central subject was the miller. It read, "On this site stands Alaric's Mill, built anew in 1158 after the Great Flood, to the design of Alaric the Miller, whose innovation was recognized by royal patent." For generations, this mill has been the heart of Oakham, a symbol of English ingenuity and endurance. One bright, crisp autumn day, much like the day Alaric had passed, a young woman stood before the mill. She was a university student, a historian, her satchel heavy with books and a digital tablet. She had come to study the mill for her thesis on medieval technological diffusion. She had read the dry accounts in the royal rolls, the clinical descriptions in the monastic chronicles. She had seen the diagrams labeled Sensus Molendinarius. But standing there, feeling the low, subsonic thrum of the turning wheel through the soles of her modern shoes, the words on the page dissolved. She watched the water, silver and powerful, pour over the paddles. She saw the timeless, patient strength of the granite stones. This was not a diagram. This was a living thing. The current miller, a direct descendant in a line that had remained unbroken, saw her studying the plaque. He was a man in his 50s, his face bearing the familiar flour-dusted calm of his ancestors. He stepped out, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Interested in the old place?" he asked, his voice friendly.
"It's incredible," the young woman said, her eyes wide. "To think it's been turning for almost 900 years, because of one man's idea." The miller smiled, a warm, knowing expression. "Oh, it was more than an idea. It was a life. My boys are inside. Would you like to see?" He led her into the roaring, fragrant interior. The scene was a bridge across time. The machinery was the same, the process identical. Two of his sons were at work, one monitoring the grain hopper, the other testing the emerging flour with his fingers, his head cocked to the song of the stones. They were the image of all the millers who had come before. The historian watched, mesmerized. She saw now not a historical artifact, but a continuity. She understood now that Alaric's true legacy was not the wheel, or the patent, or even the stories. It was this, the passing of knowledge from one hand to another, the unbroken chain of skill and care, the understanding that some things, the need for bread, the power of water, the duty to one's community, were eternal. She left the mill hours later, her mind buzzing, her thesis completely reshaped. She had gone seeking data and found a soul. As she walked away, the sound of the mill followed her, a deep, persistent heartbeat. Inside, the miller watched his son's work. He walked over to the great millstones and laid a hand on them. A habitual, affectionate gesture passed down through generations. The stone was cool and solid, its furrows worn deep by countless tons of grain, by the endless turning of the years. He thought of Alaric, his many times great-grandfather, a man he knew only as a name and a feeling, a presence in the mill's very timbers. He was not a ghost to be feared, but a foundation to be built upon. The legend was not carved just on the plaque outside, or in the folk tales of the village. It was ground into the granite itself, woven into the fabric of the community, encoded in the DNA of his own family. It was in the cool, smooth river stone that still sat on the mantelpiece in the cottage, a treasured heirloom. The wheel turned. The stones ground. The flour flowed. The world outside changed with dizzying speed. But here, on the banks of the Wending, the essential work of life continued. Alaric's story was over, but his song was not. It was a melody without end, played on the water and the stone, a humble, magnificent legend, written not in ink, but in the unending, nourishing flow of time itself.